And we're live. Welcome everybody to the chat. It gives me great pleasure to bring in two very special guests. We have the boxing librarian from Hardline Boxing Talk. Welcome, my friend.
Yeah, thank you, Random. Thank you for hosting this stream that I'm sure is going to be a great chat with some listings of great fighters. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yep, and also we have Scrapbook Boxing from Scrapbook Boxing's Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs. Scrap, thanks for joining us, my friend.
Absolutely, Random. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to speak with my man here, BL, and Random Acoustic Thoughts. So it should be a great conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, and just as a disclaimer, I am completely out of my depth here. I'm excited for this conversation as much as any of the listeners. Thanks to everyone for tuning in, and everyone after the fact, thank you also for checking this out. Check out Hardline Boxing Talk and Scrapbook Boxing Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs on YouTube. There's just a wealth of information and content there for your enjoyment and education. So what we're doing here today is we are counting down the top 10 greatest heavyweights, 1900 to 1925. We didn't set a criteria here. We just said, okay, that's what we're aiming for. So, I think maybe just to start, we'll start with you, BL. What do you think of when you think of greatness? Like if you crafted a perfect fighter in your mind, what would those attributes be? What does greatness mean to you in the context of boxing?
Well, not going on the automated ratings, going on rating a fighter based on what I think. A fighter has to have both the physical and mental capabilities and the skills to compete at the top level. He also has to fight a large amount of opponents at that top level to show that he is capable of being amongst them, if you understand me. It's basically, titles and individual wins matter a certain amount, but also the capabilities of fighter and the overall resume also factor a lot. The capabilities in ring, the skill sets, things like that. I kind of look at a broad spectrum of things when I'm not like automated rating fighters. I look at a broad spectrum of things. But it has to be a fighter who's both capable, skilled, able to compete at top level, whether it's slightly with a losing element or a winning element, but just showing that he's on that level, at the top level, where he can fight the top level fighters and hold his ground and give them good fights. That's what I look for in a fighter.
Interesting. Scrapbook, may I ask, what does greatness mean to you?
Well, there's many criterias for the most part, but to me, to sum it up in just a few words, greatness means that you bring out the best in yourself and your opponent in every conceivable fashion. You have to be able to take a punch. You have to be able to punch enough to be able to stay in the fight. You have to have somewhat of an IQ, be able to think or set a man up, because you're going to have situations where that opponent is either larger than you, he's stronger than you, he may even be able to have faster hands or outthink you. So you have to have a plan B and a plan C. So your IQ has to be, if not at the highest level, it has to be strong enough to be able to compete. You got to be able to fight back in any situation that you deal with. You have to have the opponents on your resume. You have to be able to fight the men who are considered the best in your time as often as you can. And to me, when I look at a resume like that, that's a great fighter.
Nice. Well said. Yeah, and I'd just add that for me, I was thinking, well, it's the ability and the willingness to face and overcome adversity. Like I was thinking about a lot, like there's so many different ways you could do with statistics, accomplishment. But for me, the fighting spirit backed up by a resume. Because there are guys who look fantastic, they just don't have a lot of high-level work. And as we all know, from the history of combat sports, it's very easy to look fantastic until you meet the bad style matchup or until you face a setback that might shake someone's confidence, and the greats can get through that. And it's complicated by the fact that not everyone, like the spread of high-level work through someone's careers is patterned differently to career. So I think it's good that we didn't actually set a criteria, because that would have just been more of a math problem, or, you know, that we're keeping it totally subjective. And there's really, all these fighters are great in their own way that we'll be mentioning. And so this isn't really trying to pit one against each other than, okay, well, let's see who's got the most to celebrate about them. And in the spirit of that, BL, I believe you're going to go first. Would you like to unveil your number 10? I know, you, like myself, you're coming down to the last few seconds, still trying to figure it out. So this was a tough one.
Yes, indeed I am. Yes, indeed I am. So my number 10, okay, I've got my list here on this paper. My number 10 is actually the ghost of Joplin, Jeff Clark. Now, my bottom two did actually change to an amount. But today, in fact, even recently, I've been thinking that I must include him. The reasons are, A, he was a very skilled fighter, an underrated fighter, a very good mover on his feet, had an excellent jab, had great defensive skills. Now, some people would say, well, Jeff Clark didn't score enough high-level wins to really factor in a top 10, but I actually disagree and agree to an extent. Yes, later in his career, from like 1916, 1917 on, he suffered more reverses against the top elite opposition than what he did wins. But he also scored his own number of good wins. I mean, right back in 1913, when he lost to Joe Jeanette on points over 10 rounds. In 1912 to 1914, Joe Jeanette were in imperious form. Okay, he lost a decision to Joe Jeanette. He also drew in 1913 to the Black Panther Harry Wills, okay, which again is not a win, but is a fight that was very, very close. In 1914, he beat Sam Langford himself, okay, he beat the mighty Boston Bone Crusher himself. And throughout his career, the one thing that it showed, even from the Kid Norfolk win in 1915 and going on and on and on, Jeff Clark showed, even though he lost many fights to McVeigh, Wills and Langford, including the 1916 loss to Wills, where Wills was in imperious form and was out to get him and won on points over 20 rounds. Jeff Clark demonstrating incredible defensive skills to get through that fight. Wills were in devastating form. But all the way through his career, he's fought a very high level of opposition. He even beat Gunboat Smith twice, my Gunboat, so anyone who criticizes him, I will come for you. But my Ed Smith, okay, he beat him twice in 1917. Okay, now Gunboat Smith, many people don't realize, was going to be a challenger for Jack Johnson. Plans that got scuppered when he got DQ'd against Georges Carpentier a number of years before that. But at one point, Gunboat Smith was seen as a high rising heavyweight contender. He was 6'2.5". Jeff Clark beat him on 2 occasions. He also fought one of the most devastating punchers, Sam McVeigh, a whole number of times in this time. Like in 1917, he fought Sam McVeigh on 2 occasions, okay. He lost one on points over 20 rounds. That was a very, very close fight. Some people even thought, you know, that Jeff Clark may have nicked it. The follow-up fight after that, where McVeigh stopped him in 15, you know, that was a more one-sided affair where McVeigh was able to impose his strength and his power to break Clark down. But this is my point on Jeff Clark and why I have to include him on the list. You know, following that, he beats Sam Langford again in 1918. So even though he doesn't have a massive winning record against the best heavyweights he fought, he scored enough signature wins for me to merit being rated. Also coupled to that, his great skill set of his boxing, his moving, his defensive skills. You know, when Langford first fought him, he only had 7 defeats in just over 100 fights. So, you know, we're talking about a guy who can clearly fight. And like I've said before, you know, in other eras, you know, great fighters cannot dominate all elite fighters in their era. So anybody who fights Jeff Clark's level of opposition is bound to suffer a number of defeats and blips on his record. That goes with territory when you're fighting opposition of that type. I mean, we're talking about a guy who fought Sam Langford 3 times on the trot at one point and won one and drew the other 2. Okay, so we're talking about a fighter who can compete against some of the greatest fighters of all time, which is why I included Jeff Clark, number 10, on my list.
Fantastic. I know that Clark made your list. Scrap, would you like to unveil your number 10? Oh, you still with us, Scrapbook?
Yeah, my screen blanked out for a quick second. My number 10, very interesting. And like both of you guys, I kept changing my list even as we were speaking, because this is so tedious here. But I have Edward Bearcat Wright as number 10. And I was scrambling between him and George Godfrey, the Leaperville Shadow. I couldn't choose him because he fought between 1919 and 1937. That's not quite the criteria. We're looking for 1900 to 25. There's just so many different reasons why I couldn't choose certain fighters. I even looked at Harry Grabb as a number 10 opponent because he fought a lot of heavyweights. But I boiled down to Edward Bearcat Wright. I mean, here's a man who was in the ring with Sam Langford 5 times, Jack Johnson, George Godfrey, James Tut Jackson, Big Bill Tate. And he came around at a time where you just didn't get the opportunities that you deserve. But there's no, I can't choose a fighter whether he had opportunities or not. I have to choose him based on his career. And based on his career, I think he deserves the number 10 spot in the criteria that we're looking for between 1900 and 1925. So I go with Edward Bearcat Wright as my number 10 best heavyweight during that era.
Very interesting. I apologize to the listeners and to yourself. I had some difficulties with some of my uploads. I don't have photos for everyone who's going to come up. I believe I have most of them, but I don't have everyone. So for my number 10, the last time I tried to do this list, for number 10, I went, let me find my graphic here. Yeah, so number 10, although there were several people who could have made the thing, I got Jim Jeffries. And have some, it's a tricky thing ranking greatness, right? Because there are fighters who are great in ability and do win at a high level, but then they have a big drawback, like, I don't know, color line in this time, that's not that great. But looking at, because boxing was so rich in this era and people could still find super high level fights without fighting everybody, I let him edge in at the bottom of the list over a couple other guys that I could have mentioned. I'm not going to say too much about him. If you guys want to add, I know this is far more your specialty if you guys want to add on his career, but probably his most famous fight historically was his comeback, which went horribly, but prior to that, he was a beast. And so I gave him a little bit of credit. I let him edge in at number 10. You guys want to add something to that? Flush that out for me?
Well, I can add something. With Jim Jeffries, I had struggled with him as well. He had 18 bouts that he didn't have as many bouts as he needed for us to really see adversity with him. And he wasn't diverse than his opponents enough for me. So that's why I struggled. But the guys that he did fight, I mean, he took on some very, very tough fighters such as Bob Fitzsimmons and James Corbett, Gus Rulin. I mean, he was in there with very tough opponents, but not enough work for me to add him on a list of 10 greatest fighters in the heavyweight division from 1900 to 1925. And also, he retired in 1909, so he didn't have enough fights between 1900 to 25 for me to add him in the criteria in which we're speaking. So that's why I don't have him on the top 10 in this conversation.
Yeah, that's perfectly understandable. I almost didn't, but I thought, well, I gave him a shout because I did look at who were the dominant guys or appeared to be the dominant guys at different parts of the quarter century. But yeah, he could have easily been replaced by a few fellas. BL, anything to add on this gentleman? Are you still with us, BL?
Yeah, it's okay. I'll break down more on him when I get to him.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's keep it moving. I appreciate this, and to all the listeners, I myself am learning a lot here. I'm here to learn far more than I'm here to talk, which is why until we get to the top of the list, I'm not going to have a whole lot to say. Certainly don't want to overspeak my part. So, BL, number 9, give it to us, brother.
My number 9, I'm including him because I'm a fanboy. No, I'm not really. My number 9 is actually Gunboat Smith. Gunboat Smith was a 6'2.5" heavyweight. He threw long straight punches. He was an economical puncher. He was a good boxer for his time. You know, fought many top fighters around that time, beat contenders like Porky Dan Flynn, Al Kubiak, you know, beat Frank Moran, of course, who would fight Jack Johnson a few years later, beat him, also beat fighters like Bombardier, Billy Wells. He also beat the future fairly weak heavyweight champion in my mind, Jess Willard, also beat fireman Jim Flynn, beat contenders like Tony Ross, and also beat Sam Langford, okay, in 1913. Then he suffered the loss to Georges Carpentier by DQ, which actually ruled him out of challenging Jack Johnson. I do not think he would have beaten Jack Johnson, but it would have been, you know, a feather in his cap fighting for the world heavyweight title. And even beyond that, okay, he went on after that. He lost to Sam Langford, of course, in a rematch, lost to Battling Levinsky, later came back and beat Battling Levinsky, you know, and just generally fought a very tough career, fought really tough fighters like Charlie Weinert, lost to the Hoosier Bearcat Jack Dillon, which was a heavyweight fight, beat Big Tom Cowler, you know, in 1915. He just fought, for me, a high level of opposition and scored many good enough wins that I had to include him on my list at number 9.
Fantastic. Scrap, anything to add on that? You're welcome to.
That's a great choice. That's a great choice. And I can understand every single thing BL said about that. As you think back, wow, that was a very good choice. I didn't have him at number 9. But I think he deserves somewhere between number 6 or so as well, depending upon how you look at it. Because he was really a fearsome fighter. Ed Gunbo Smith was something else, man. You know, what really got me is when Sam Langford didn't answer the 7th round. You know, it told me a lot about Ed Gunbo Smith. And I'm sorry, that's Fred Fulton. I'm thinking of Fred Fulton because he's my next fighter. I'm giving it away. But no, Ed Gunbo Smith was a very good fighter. He really was. So I could see why BL would select him. That's a great choice, BL. It really is.
Thank you, Scott.
Yeah, and I almost had him instead of Jeffries. It's close because, you know, he got a win over a prime Sam Langford. To me, I'm looking at when someone obviously we don't judge people by single performances, but when people have a handful of like really, really great wins, that it counts for a lot. Sometimes can make up for a smaller career. They're modern era guys who don't have 200 fights, but the resume is deep compared to some of the smaller versions of the resumes from this era. But we're going to get to the monster resumes shortly. So Scrap, you just go right on in to your number 9.
My number 9 is Jeff Clark, the Joplin Ghost. He was a very, very good fighter, 5'10", weighed 165 to 193 pounds. He was in a ring with Dixie Kid on his 4th professional fight. Very interesting. He fought him a total of 3 times, lost to him twice, and had one no decision. Between September 24th, 1908 and November 15th, 1909, he had some really good fights with Dixie Kid. So that was very interesting. And he would move up in weight and challenge the heavyweights as his career went on. He was also in the ring with Sam McVeigh, knocked him out in 1 round. I thought that was very interesting. Jack Thompson and Battling Levinsky, Sam Langford, between February 14, 21 and October 26, 1914. He was in there with Harry Wells and Peter Maher, Joe Jeanette, and he KO'd Dave Holly. So I have to put him in there. For me, I think he's deserving of that spot. BL has him in 10. I have him in 9. Very interesting. Very interesting. But he's my number 9 pick.
Fantastic choice, Scrap. Not only because it is a fantastic choice, but it's also because it's my number 9. I had to put Jeff Clark in there. But some of that's it's not sentimentality, but it's just in awe of the level this man fought at. When you talk about, you know, there are more modern greats where, you know, people think of 3 or 4 great fights. They had like world class, great opponents, and that defines their legacy. Jeff Clark, he was spitting out elite level fights and a crazy schedule around it at a pace that just we don't see today. I mean, it's hard to even conceive of someone being that durable. but as a great jabber mover, I mean, he had a lot of stoppages, but at the highest level, like he was the guy who was hard to pin down. And you know, the one thing that really stood out to me about him was, so as I'm researching Sam Langford, Langford's manager insisted that they wouldn't fight Jeff Clark in a large ring. They wanted the ring reduced because he was that good at moving. Now, Langford, as you guys both know, and as a lot of the listeners, the regulars on your channels know, Langford's one of the great ring cutters to ever live because he could fight from a square stance. And so he could, and he was set low, so he could just walk directly at somebody. We see it in the footage of the Bill Lang fight in 1911. At one point, you know, he goes from a more of a bladed stance and he just starts walking him down like directly at him. You don't see fighters do that. So for him to be concerned about Clark having room to move really stands out to me. Is like how great this guy was, but also who he fought. Like BL in your stab videos, there's, you know, he's right up there at the very top of rounds and fights against Hall of Famers. So he's in that select group, right?
Yes, he is. Yeah, he scores very highly in those stat categories. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I suppose, you know, for him, even though at the highest levels he might have had a losing record, he did so much work that he has more high level wins or draws than a lot of other people who are considered legitimately great. So the sum of his careers just astounds me, and so that's why I had him in. Let's proceed forward. BL, you're number 8, I believe, correct?
Yes, my number 8. I have actually gone for Tommy Burns. Okay, and the reason I've gone for Tommy Burns is he was a world heavyweight champion for a few years, from when he won it in 1906 to when he lost it to Jack Johnson at the end of 1908. But some of the reasons I've picked him is he was the world heavyweight champion and made 11 title defenses in those few years alone. Also, he did that as a former middleweight fighter, because a lot of people don't realize Tommy Burns actually was a middleweight fighter at one point, and traversed up to be fight at heavyweight, where he did beat Marvin Hart. Okay, he was a very good fighter who'd beaten Jack Johnson. You know, in the 1900s, Marvin Hart was a tough fighter, rugged fighter, good power in both hands. Not the most skilled fighter, but a hard fighter to beat. He'd beaten him to become world heavyweight champion. Then he beat fighters like Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, fireman Jim Flynn. He beat Australian heavyweight Bill Lang. Amongst those 11 defenses before losing to Jack Johnson. To me, Tommy Burns doesn't have the thickest resume of the fighters, certainly not the fighters I have to come, but he was world heavyweight champion and did at that time set a virtual record of heavyweight title defenses in only a few years. And I think fighting all those defenses from when he won the title in February 1906, he made 11 defenses by December 1908, fighting good or decent opposition in that time, and were consistently winning, also scoring lots of knockouts in those heavyweight title fights. I elected to put Tommy Burns at number 8. Excellent choice.
Excellent choice. Underrated fighter, not a particularly large heavyweight, underrated. You know, he was a serious dude, and certainly you, in a champion, what do you want from a champion? You want him to put that title at stake as much as possible. And there are fighters with maybe deeper resumes who didn't do that. They were like holding on to a title. So yeah, credit to him for that. Scrap, would you like to hit on your number 8 now?
Absolutely. Number 8, I have Tommy Gibbons. Tommy Gibbons. He was out of St. Paul, and he had about over 100 fights. He had about 4 losses, and he had a good fight with Jack Dempsey. Now, the thing with the Jack Dempsey fight is that people had a lot of confidence in him. It was in Shelby, Montana, and they basically put up the entire town's bank on him. And unfortunately for that town, they went bankrupt because Jack Dempsey had something to say about that. He demanded $200,000 up front, and he got it. And he walked out of that town and left the town bankrupt. But Tommy Gibbons was something else, man. In his 5th fight, he fought Joe Burrell, and he fought Willie K.O. Brennan. He was in the ring with Billy Misk and Buck Krause. Harry Greb several times, battling Nowitzki, George Chip. I mean, you name it, he was in the ring with them. And for that reason, I place him number 8. I think he's deserving of it, based on how you look at it. But I gotta give him number 8. So he's my number 8, Tommy Gibbons.
Fantastic choice. Powerful fighter. So for my number 8, like as with this entire list, everything past my top 6 was very difficult indeed. But I ended up going with Noah Brusso, aka Tommy Burns, Canadian fighter. And I give him more credit than a lot of guys because even though he got a life-changing payday, and Jack Johnson didn't, he did put the title up on the line to the great Jack Johnson, who a lot of the world of pugilism at the time thought would school him. And he did. So like he was, but I give him credit. He fought a lot as a champion. He had some very good wins. And he did what? So when I'm thinking of greatness, I'm thinking of a guy like Tommy Burns. Like he didn't sit on a belt. Not all of his competition was at the highest level, but he fought so many title fights in that burst that he did get a lot of high level work in. And yeah, a lot of credit to him. And I think he got actually, I can't remember if it was in 1910 or 12, but he got injured and he was out for 2 years. I think maybe he could have done even more. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily count what people don't get to do, but just when you think about what someone could have, like what they already did, plus like, what he didn't necessarily just bow out, at least that I've seemed to have seen in the archives. So a lot of credit to him. So yeah, I had to give him that slot. BL, I think it's a great time for you to unveil your number 7.
Yes, and this is another fighter who I have changed my opinion on, okay, from even earlier this evening, because it is hard picking a list like this, and I've definitely had to consider a number of things. My actual pick for my number 7, okay, from my original pick, partially the change helped out by Scrapbook Boxing, who pointed something out to me, is actually going to be the St. Paul Thunderbolt, Billy Misk. That is who I'm going to pick for number 7. The reason I am picking Billy Misk for number 7 is Billy Misk has an underrated resume, full stop. Now, he did fight at one point as a light heavyweight, okay, but he also fought many times as a heavyweight, especially later in his career. He was more fighting at light heavyweight up until like 1916, but then 1917, he started traversing to become a heavyweight and have many heavyweight fights. He lost, okay, to Kid Norfolk in 1917, also beat Charlie Weiner in 1917, and from there went through an entire period, okay, where he beat Jack Dillon, he drew with Fred Fulton, beat Gumbo Smith, who I have on this list. He lost to Jack Dempsey, he drew with Willie Meehan, beat Gumbo Smith again, okay, drew with Harry Greb, lost to Jack Dempsey, beat Fireman Jim Flynn, beat Big Tom Cowler twice, lost to Harry Greb. Then he scored wins over 2 very good heavyweights from that time. One is Bill K.O. Brennan, who was a very good heavyweight contender. And the other is Willie Meehan, who always gave Jack Dempsey nightmarish fights and gained wins over Jack Dempsey and draws against Jack Dempsey. Willie Meehan was a handful. He slapped with his punches. He was a bit podgy, but he was a tough, rugged fighter. He was hard to break down and hard to tag with clean shots. He was a very capable fighter. And even from there, when Billy Misk went forward, he fought and lost to fighters like, Tommy Gibbons. He beat Bill Brennan again a number of times going forward in his career. Also beat Tommy Gibbons at heavyweight, beat other decent fighters, like Martin Burke, etc., etc. That is why I think Billy Misk deserves a shout out. He was also, to me, one of the more capable fighters of that time. I mean, and also, the story of his fight with Bill Brennan, a story I've recounted before. He had a severe health condition, arranged this fight with Bill Brennan to gain one last payday so he could have a great Christmas with his family. And he did. He put on a brilliant performance and shattered Bill Brennan with a great performance. His last fight, a great performance, gained his payday, had a great Christmas, and a few days into New Year, actually passed away from his health condition. But when you look at who he fought and who he beat and the other great fighters he fought, who he stretched at limit, that's why I've elected to put Billy Misk number 7.
Very nice. Scrapbook, would you like to either add to that or unveil your number 7? Oh, I think you might be muted.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. My phone keeps going on. I apologize. I want to back up what BL said. The thing with Billy Misk, where I really gained so much respect for him, was that last fight with Bill Brennan. Because Bill Brennan challenged Jack Dempsey in New York's Madison Square Garden. It was in 1920. And he fought Dempsey twice. But the thing with Billy Misk was a small man coming up to heavyweight. He was sick at the time of his last fight with Bill Brennan. He was in the ring with Jack Dempsey himself. In fact, Jack Dempsey has stamped a glove shape in his chest. It was bright red, like cherry red. And that's how you knew then that Billy Misk was really starting to get sick from bright disease. The character, you asked me earlier about what's greatness. I think Billy Misk displays what greatness really is. Doesn't always mean you're a champion. Doesn't always mean you have the strongest resume. It doesn't always mean that you're undefeated. It means what you do under certain circumstances and who you do it with. The names that BL had listed to you is incredible because Billy Misk wasn't just sick then. He was sick for many fights before he was diagnosed. So you got to give him a lot of credit. BL, that's a great pick. You know, it's so many great fighters that's overlooked. You don't look at the detail, so you don't always consider them. But that was a great pick. It was.
Oh, thank you, Scrapbook. I mean, just to back a point further there, Scrapbook's made. I mean, what he said about he was ill for some time before that Bill Brennan fight, he was, and even in the 18 months prior to that final fight, he still had enough in him, even though he was ill, to beat both Tommy Gibbons and knock Fred Fulton out in one round. So you know that shows how good of a fighter he was.
Yeah, it's a wonderful. It's a wonderful tribute. You guys make me want to change my list. I'm serious. As we're going through this, I'm like, oh, that's a good point. I should have thought of that. Like I've already, but I think, there's so many great fighters and different versions of greatness, and that kind of sacrifice that does something in the realm of pugilism where it is a sacrifice. You sacrifice your body and put a lot on the line to earn, and especially, earn for their families. So it's something to be respected. And, I'm glad today, in spite of all the frustrations fans have, more guys can make really good money. They can get something, they can get more. A lot of these guys here that we're discussing, they didn't get what they deserved for the great things they did, even if they were rich compared to the average standard of living for just tough guys who weren't well schooled. I mean, still. So it's good. So there are some great things about boxing today, but what these guys went through, when we're just looking at resumes and these great achievements, yeah, I mean, we can celebrate this. It's not a business rating. I don't think any of us were thinking about business when we put these together. Is that a fair assumption?
Yes, very much so.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think, see, now I'm torn. But I'll go with what I had. So I think for me, I'm gonna go with let me load this up. I'm gonna go with Gene Tunney. And there are some arguments against him, which is why he isn't any higher, even though he was remarkably successful as a boxer. One loss, and that one loss was to someone who all three of us rank inside the top 2 all time, right? Harry Greb.
Yeah.
And Harry Greb himself, I almost put him down instead of Jeffries at 10 because Harry Greb's heavyweight resume is fantastic. In fact, BL,
he's a lot bigger than Gene Tunney's.
Yeah. But I count the wins, the wins that weren't close. The definitive wins over Greb. So they had, I think, wasn't it their rematch where it wasn't like some decisive thing? after he
Yeah,
got slew the first time.
that was the second fight where after losing first fight badly, and then originally Tony gave him credit saying he's a great fighter. Within a month of losing, he changed it, and his management team started the furor that Greb just won because he's a dirty cheat, and that built up into a furor prior to the second fight where Greb were actually having things pelted at him on his ring walk because they'd built up so much hysteria over it. That's when his wife were contacting commission and they were sending his wife telegrams, and yeah, it were a mess. But many people said after the second fight that it was a scandalous outrage. I think 14 or 15 out of 22 newspaper writers who scored the fight at ringside all like Greb winning. They said it were a travesty. There should be inquiries into it and everything. But yeah, I mean, the only real fight Tony beat Greb properly was the fifth fight, really. Another fight before that were a draw. Tony lost the first one. And even the other two were very close.
Yeah, so I think because of how highly I rate Greb's ability to win at heavyweight, even if he could still fight down at middle and light heavy, you know, even though like their series it wasn't just like, oh, Greb got lucky and then it was easy. I still, because of his overall success, his ratio of wins to loss to draws, like I put Tunney in here, and I have, but I should have maybe just stuck Greb in there. The amount of work he did at heavyweight. You've done videos on that, BL. It's pretty. You did a video like, well, does he have a great heavyweight resume? And all the names, oh my gosh. And guys, Greb schooled guys who gave other world-class guys hard nights. You've emphasized that a lot over time. So I had to put Tunney in here, even though, I mean, he doesn't have a large heavyweight resume, but was he great at what he did? Yes, he was remarkably great. And his only loss, even though it was a brutal, vicious bloodbath loss to the great Harry Greb, overall in his career, he was remarkably successful. So, and he was a technical fighter. He studied opponents, so that's pretty great too. He's one of the guys who could probably do well today. With his existing skill set. He's very clever.
He was a great box fighter for sure.
Yeah, so I give him that credit. My list, I don't know if I have a crap list or not, but there are so many different arguments, and every time you guys bring someone up, I'm like, oh, I should have had them in there. But we're getting to the waters where I'm a little bit more comfortable up here, and I appreciate you guys' time. Thank you for the guys. I'll shout out the comments at some point, but let's I think we should move forward. But credit to Tunney, but also, Greb and all these great fighters. What Greb did before he got a world title shot is silly. It's like 3 modern careers in a row or more before he even could do it. It's like, so some of these guys, so Greb, shout out to Harry Greb, but also shout out to Gene Tunney. Very, very excellent fighter. So where are we at now? So we've completed the next cycle. BL, is it your turn to unveil your next one?
Yes, I believe so. Now, my number 6, is my final fighter outside of a certain group of fighters. These 6 names, actually, for me, before I unveil my number 6, were the first 6 names on the list. They were automatic entries. And I actually had the order out within 2 minutes because I already knew in my head where these guys had to go in comparison to each other. So my number 6, and some people may think he should score higher, but I disagree. My number 6 is actually Jack Dempsey, the Manasseh Mauler. Now, some people will say, well, he was a darling at Roaring Twenties. Well, I don't care about his popularity. Some people say, well, he drew $1 million gate. Well, I don't care about $1 million gate. What I care about is how great of a fighter he was, what his opposition was, and did he fight all the best fighters of his time. Now, if Jack Dempsey had have fought a Sam Langford, 1917, 1919, if he would have fought a Harry Wills, he may have scored higher on my list, but sadly, those names are missing, as are names of other fighters who called him out, like Kid Norfolk, George Godfrey. Jack Dempsey had a whole number of opportunities to fight these men and did not. So I can only rate him on the career he has, accepting that many of the top heavyweights around at the time who were actually after a fight with him did not get that chance. Now, obviously, I'm not really considering the fights were Tunney because they were after 1925, the same with the win over Jack Sharkey. But going up to 1925, his last fight was in 1923 because he had that break prior to coming back 3 years later against Tunney. His last win was against Luis Angel Firpo. Now, one of the reasons why I do give Dempsey an amount of credit is not for the resume he did fight, minusing those key names that would have strengthened his career, who he should have fought, but the destructive performance against Jess Willard. I mean, that one of the most brutal destructions I've ever witnessed in a boxing ring. You know, he did beat Billy Misk, okay? He beat Billy Misk in 3 rounds, in 1920. He did beat Bill Brennan, but it must be said that Brennan actually gave Dempsey harder fights than Brennan gave Harry Greb. Harry Greb handled him way easier and way more, with less struggle, I'll say. He did beat Georges Carpentier, okay? He did beat Tommy Gibbons, and he beat Luis Angel Firpo. You know, that is not too much work there, really, when we're looking at a 4-year period. You know, we're looking at 6 fights in 4 years. And even though the names were good, 6 fights in 4 years for me is not good enough when looking at this list. You know, he had a fight series with William Ian. He scored some wins. He had some losses. He struggled. You know, he beat Fred Fulton in 1 round. You know, he was also stopped in 1 round himself by fireman Jim Flynn earlier in his career. He did come back and knock fireman Jim Flynn out in 1 round. He did beat Gunboat Smith on points, and he was world heavyweight champion, from 1919 until losing that association to Gene Tunney in 1926. So he is a multiple-year lineal champion, and he did put on many fantastic fights. The Firpo fight is an absolute brawl for 2 rounds, 11 knockdowns in 2 rounds. The destruction against Jess Willard, the really hard fight he had against Tommy Gibbons. He could not put Gibbons down and keep him down. You know, he even said he found it virtually impossible to tag him on chin clean. You know, Gibbons fought a great defensive fight and spoiled him and tied him up and, you know, made it hard for Dempsey to get the shots off to try and finish the fight. So for these reasons, I put Jack Dempsey number 6, and for the other reasons I mentioned, first off, you know, minusing those major names, sadly, number 6 was as high as he could go.
Righteous. Scrapbook, would you like to talk about your number 6?
Yeah, every time it's my turn, something happens with my phone. I apologize. So my number 6. Now, I don't think I did 7, but I'm just going to say it was Fred Fulton. But my number 6.
Oh, no, I don't think you did, actually.
Yeah, I don't think I did, but it was a Fred Fulton. Fred Fulton was stopped only 4 times. So my recollection, it was Jack Dempsey, it was Harry Wells, it was Roulant, and I can't think of the 4th person. But he was only stopped 4 times. He had a lot of fights. He stopped Sam Langford in 7 rounds. I think he's a very good prospect for this conversation. But I chose him. I chose him for number 7. So I'm going to stick with number 7 because he was in it with a lot of very good fighters with Fred Fulton.
Yeah, for sure. I think Billy Misk was the other fighter who stopped him in 1 round, wasn't he?
Yes, he did stop. You're right. Yes, it was Billy Misk. Yes.
Also, guys, is it fair to say that among all the heavyweights that Sam Langford fought, Fulton was one of the ones who figured him out the best? Even though he caught him on the downslide, Langford was still world class at that point, and he gave him the significant, put him in the hospital from his jab. That was something a lot of great fighters hadn't been able to do to Langford, even though he was getting a little bit past it. Could you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. Oh, sorry, Scrapbook.
No, you go ahead, BL. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, Fred Fulton in those fights with Langford. I mean, one thing about it is he did do well to keep Langford at a range where he could pound him with his jab, because as Langford had demonstrated, even against bigger fighters, he had a very good ability to break inside using that old lightweight and welterweight foot speed to break inside at speed and fire them devastating short hooks to chin. So actually, Fred Fulton did do well to keep him on outside, and he, with kind of Mike McCallum type efficiency, just kept pumping that jab and bust Langford up. You know, Langford couldn't successfully get inside, and when he did, Fulton tied him up you know, fairly effectively. So yeah, it was a good display because, like I said, many other big, tall fighters, Langford didn't have trouble getting to. So it definitely did something right in the fight.
Yeah, so I give a lot of credit to Fulton because you know, putting a severe beating on one of the all-time great, like someone we rank supremely high in the pecking order. I'll just put it that way. But yeah, fantastic fighter, Fred Fulton, tough. You know, like some other great fighters, he's maybe remembered most for a loss, but that doesn't really change what they did or who they were. He was a fierce guy, and you know, in this era, as you guys know, when the champion is not being very active, Jack Johnson was not that active as a champion. He certainly wasn't active necessarily against all top guys. Like as the establishment champion, not his color championship reign, which was magnificent, but he wasn't that active as the world champ. So other guys were doing all the work. If you're talking about actual fights, high level fights, and so in the reign of Willard and Dempsey, like these guys weren't the champions weren't doing most of the work. So guys like Fulton, even if he's just a contender, my goodness, what a resume to put together. So deserves a huge amount of credit. It's great to see him on this list. So Scrap, I'm sorry, I got so muddled up because you guys are swaying me as I'm trying to go through my list. So are we at your next one following Fulton? Would you like to unveil that, sir?
Sure. My number 6 is Joe Jeanette, the Iron Man. And the reason why I chose him, number 6, is because the other guys ahead of him. But Joe Jeanette was something else.
Sorry.
Yeah, he was in battling Jim Johnson. Battling Jim Johnson, I mean, he fought him 11 times. Battling Jim Johnson was something else. He was the first black fighter to get a championship fight from a black champion, which was Jack Johnson. But he was in there with Sam Langford. He was in there with so many fighters. So battling Jim Johnson was a very good fighter. And Joe Jeanette was in there with him 11 times. He was in there with Jack Johnson 10 times. He was in there with Sam McVeigh 3 times. I mean, he was in there with everybody. He was in there with George Cole and Kid Norton, Harry Wills and Young Peter Jackson, Big Bill Tate. He fought him 4 times. So I don't know who this man could not defeat because, again, the time that he came, he fought in the street before he actually got organized boxing because of a dare. You know, one of his friends dared him to do something like that. He did it, and he was successful even in that. From Hoboken, New Jersey, and he was good enough to have a street name right next to where his home was. I mean, everyone respected him, but he was a hell of a fighter, man. So I have him ranked number 6, Joe Jeanette. Great fighter.
Absolutely. And Iron Man really does describe him, even because he fought in an era of all-time great heavyweights. Just one of the richest texture that you could possibly imagine in so many different ways. And everyone knew Jeanette. I'm sure we will get to him. So if I'm not mistaken, we're at my number 6. My number 6, I actually went with the Manasseh Mauler. I went with Jack Dempsey. He was great. And you know, when I look at titles, because the champions were often the inactive ones at heavyweight and everyone else was doing a lot of work to get to a title shot. But another reason I had to put Tommy Burns in, even though his resume isn't as deep as other guys, is he was an active champion. You can't say that man wasn't like putting that title up and gave a shot to Jack Johnson at a time when the other guys are like, black man can't get a title shot at heavyweight, which is sad and pathetic, and you know, but not to be avoided in discussion either. You know, we don't have to hide from the reality. So, you know, Dempsey, I give him a lot of credit, but I don't give him as much credit as other guys, and that's why he came in at number 6. He had some fantastic performances. He was a vicious puncher. Stylistically, he was an inspiration to certain kinds of people who wanted to get into fighting. So he was an important person, and he did have tremendous success. But that's as high as I could get him. We're about to get into the real sharks in the waters.
Absolutely.
Well, we already did when Scrap put the great Joe Jeanette. Joe Jeanette is, well, I'm going to get to him. We're gonna. I'm sure we're both going to get to him. So now,
If I may add this little indicator on Joe Jeanette, he showed up at a fight venue because a young fighter called Jack Dempsey was fighting there, and Jack Dempsey's opponent had not shown up, and Joe Jeanette thought, you know what, I'll go in and offer to fight because Dempsey has no opponent. So this was before Dempsey became champion. So Joe Jeanette climbs into the ring, introduces himself to the crowd. A lot of people there know of him anyway, because what a lot of these more modern fans don't realize is these guys were well known in the time and very respected in many areas. So Joe Jeanette got in ring, an older Joe Jeanette, and he basically said, you know, I'm willing to step in and fight Dempsey. And Jack Dempsey left the ring. I think that says it all on how both respected Joe Jeanette was and how tough he was. And I also remember back in 1913, I believe it was, there was an article in New York newspaper, an interview with Jack Johnson, because he'd been trying to arrange a fight. Well, someone had been trying to arrange a fight there between him and Joe Jeanette in New York. And New York, if I recall, wouldn't allow two black fighters to fight each other within city boundaries. So basically, Jack Johnson were trying to get a fight with Al Palza or Fireman Jim Flynn, I think. And basically, you know, Jack Johnson said in this interview, oh, well, you know, if I do end up fighting Joe Jeanette, obviously I have to be ready because it's impossible to slow down or stop or discourage. So when you've got fighters like Jack Johnson saying that on Joe Jeanette, it just shows how tough he is. You know, coupled as well with the fact a younger Dempsey wouldn't fight him. Dempsey knew of him, knew who he was when he got in ring. He didn't want to fight him. A great fighter. But yeah, Jack Dempsey is a great heavyweight from that time. I agree with your pick. I just have certain issues with him that not everybody else will have, I admit.
I'm in the same boat, and that's partly why I struggle with my list, because you know, no one gets to fight everyone, right? There are guys on our list who made the attempt to fight everyone there, but no one gets to fight everyone. So we're always balancing what someone does with the context of their time. So my respect for Dempsey, like if you look at his run to the world title shot, like in this time, a lot of the guys, when you're a contender, you have to do an exponentially larger amount than the champion is doing to defend the belt, even if his fights are high level. There are lots of guys. That's how you get guys like Fulton. You know, in today's landscape, these guys would have innumerable title shots. Lots of these guys would, because there's more belts, more weight classes. But at this time, you know, so Dempsey, when he was a contender, he was doing a lot, but he didn't fight everyone. So I wanted to give, like with Tunney, I wanted to give him his credit, but without stepping over people who I feel like radiated more greatness. But he was great, and that's why I had him on my list. So now we are at our top 5. Am I correct?
Yeah.
You guys want to shout out the chat real quick?
Yeah.
Sure.
Who's in the chat?
I'll just very quickly. So Rodolfo, Andre, Khan, Nick, Andre again, Bruce, Rodolfo. I think I mentioned everyone, guys. Thanks for coming. Thanks for listening. I'm trying to keep it moving. This list, now we're getting to the point where I have certainty, but like until now, I've just been, just listening and learning from these two gentlemen from Hardline and Scrap, which most of the people who will eventually have listened to this should have or actually have listened to their channels. So some of the people listening know far more than I do. I'm just thrilled to be here. I'm here as a fan as much as anything, fan of just the rich texture. And there are guys, I guess we can do maybe some honorable mentions after, because there are guys that could easily have made someone else's top 10 list that's easily defensible, because there's a lot of greatness going on. So it's great to just celebrate these different fighters, even if we're noting their limitations as far as where they are in the pecking order. Perfectly fine. No one's perfect.
Yeah, what I like about what we're doing. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't mean to cut anyone off.
Go right ahead, sir, please.
I was going to say, what's so great about it is that all three of us, we do have different fighters, and it gives latitude to the fighters who others may not choose. And it just shows the respect that we have for the different fighters of that time, even though they may not be the same fighters that we all choose. And most of them are, but there are some that we see in a different way. And that's perfectly fine because it does give the opportunity for that fighter to get some shine. So I think that's great as well.
Yeah, I agree with that, Scrapbook. That's a very good point. Excellent point. Yeah.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you guys' time. This is fantastic for me. This couples with my research beautifully. Like, because just to be able to discuss, because I've listened to an awful lot of amount of information from you in your media. So to be able to talk to you directly, especially about this era that I've become fascinated with, especially the era that overlaps the gentleman I'm about to bring up. But if I'm not mistaken, it's
my
time
number
for
5.
your number 5. Yes, sir.
Yes, my number 5. Scrapbook will know I'm talking about as soon as I mention this. He's called by some the Mike Tyson of his time. He's actually probably one of the most powerful pound-for-pound punchers of this entire era. Goes very underrated. I am talking about the great Sam McVeigh. People mention about fighters back in the day that they were unfit and untrained. When you look at this guy, he didn't have a 6-pack, he had an 8-pack. This guy was heavily muscled, broad shoulders, immensely powerful, was very, very durable, okay, could take a lot of punishment in fights. Not only that, coupled with that, he was also a very physically strong man who could fight round after round after round on the attack. He could maintain his punching power even late in fights to round 12, 15, 18, 19, even round 20 of a 20-round fight. He could maintain his punch power. He was a major, when you've got a big puncher who can knock you out with one clean shot if he catches you right, but at the same time, he's got stamina for lots of rounds, and at the same time, is extremely durable and hard to put out. You have got a major fight on your hands. Sam McVeigh turned pro in early 1900s. In his first few years as a pro, okay, he fought Jack Johnson 3 times. He lost all 3, but he did fight Jack Johnson 3 times in his first 12 pro fights. Also, over those first few years, he fought another fighter, former colored heavyweight champion Denver Ed Martin, 4 times. Sam McVeigh lost one of them and knocked Denver Ed Martin out 3 occasions. He also then in 1907 fought Joe Jeanette. He did lose a verdict to Joe Jeanette, but then went on a knockout run of 13 or 14 straight knockouts, most of them inside 3 rounds or less. Now, the thing about him is, after then beating Joe Jeanette in 1909, February, okay, on points over 20 rounds in which he dropped Jeanette, I think 3 or 4 times, something like that. He then went later that year, 2 months later, okay, into what I call the greatest fight in boxing history, and that is at the Circuit de Paris in France against Joe Jeanette, the 49-round fight where McVeigh dropped Jeanette over 20 times, okay, in the first 25 rounds. The fact he could still drop Joe Jeanette past the 20-round mark, when Joe Jeanette is one of the most durable fighters to me in boxing history, shows McVeigh's power. Now, in the big fight, he eventually went into round 30. By round 35, Jeanette was starting to come forward and starting to push McVeigh to ropes and hit him with multi-punch combinations, uppercuts on the inside. I wish I could have been there. Well, at the same time, I wish I could have been there to witness it. I'd have probably been recoiling in horror at ringside watching the barbarism that were going on in that ring. But even after that, okay, losing that 49-round fight, he then comes back December of the same year and fights Jeanette in a 30-round fight, also in Paris, that is a draw. Okay, so he fights Joe Jeanette 3 times in 1 year, okay, and fights nearly 100 rounds. He fought 99 rounds against Joe Jeanette in 1 year, okay, in 3 fights. That's not counting his other fights. Between the Jeanette fights, he was knocking out every fighter he fought except Jim Barrett, who he won by DQ. But every opponent fought in between those fights was knocked out. And this carries on, past into 1910. It's knockout after knockout after knockout. You go from like the draw against Joe Jeanette, he goes on a knockout run until battling Jim Johnson, who's a very durable, tough heavyweight contender, draws with him on points over 15 rounds on the back of a big knockout run, draws with him, then goes on another big knockout run, then draws for Sam Langford on points over 20 rounds, then goes on another knockout run prior to beating Jack Lester on points over 20 rounds. But the thing about McVeigh is his record and his capabilities of fighting those top guys. You know, he fights Sam Langford over a dozen times. He loses a lot of them. He gains some wins in there as well. He also fights the upcoming heavyweight behemoth, Harry Wills. Now, initially, Sam McVeigh wins 2 fights against Harry Wills. Okay. The fight in 1914 that McVeigh won on points is actually a fight I've spoken on before, and it's a fight where Wills, over the first 8 or 9 rounds, were actually kind of outboxing McVeigh to an extent. McVeigh had his moments here or there, but basically from that point on, from round 9-10, McVeigh started coming forward and barging into Wills and unleashing big shots. And in the end of it, Wills were hurt a whole number of times. McVeigh ended up getting the point verdict, and many people at ringside said Wills was lucky to see the final bell. Okay, so he beat the upcoming Harry Wills on 2 occasions, once in 1914, once in 1915. Also in 1915, he beat Sam Langford, he beat battling Jim Johnson. He also drew with Sam Langford, he beat the ghost of Joplin, Jeff Clark. And all the way through his career, when you look at McVeigh's career and take into account the fights with Clark, Wills, Jeanette, Langford and Jack Johnson, from his just 100+ fights, a huge percentage of those fights are fighting those elite heavyweights. And he not only proved, you know, that he could just, you know, merit those fights, he actually proved he could fight them on a certain level and could beat them on his best day. It's kind of like Jack Johnson said, you know, when you're fighting McVeigh, he comes fit for 20 hard rounds. You know, and that was his reputation, a powerhouse who could knock you out with single shots. He was also a very clever left hooker. You know, some people don't give him credit, but he was very good at timing and hitting you with those left hooks. He developed a very cultured left hook, and he could drop that left hook on you, and if it tagged you clean, you know, you could be in a world of trouble, you know. But yeah, Sam McVeigh is my number 5.
Fantastic. What a great tribute to an amazing fighter. So if I'm not mistaken, Scrapbook, are we on your number 5, sir?
Yeah, my number 5 is also Sam McVeigh, the Oxnard Cyclone. He was something else, as BL has cleverly stated. He took 15 fights with Sam Langford, 6 draws, 7 losses, and 3 wins. Between April 1st, 1911, and September 1st, 1910, he was in there with a very strong man, a very, very strong, powerful man. So, I mean, you're looking at a very, very good fighter. And Sam McVeigh. I might have the date wrong on that. Doesn't sound right in my head. But he was in there with him, I know 1911. I think it was 1920, if I'm wrong. Please, somebody correct me. But he was also with Sam Langford. He was also in there with Jack Johnson 3 times. February 26, 1903, April 22nd, 1904. He lost to him all 3 times, but he gave him a very good fight each time he was in there with Jack Johnson. He was also in there with Harry Wills 5 times. 1 no contest, 2 wins, and 3 losses. May 19th, 1915, and September 8th, 1920. He was in the ring with Joe Jeanette 5 times. He had 2 losses, 1 win, and 1 draw between April 15th, 1907, and December 11th, 1909. He would win the South Australia Heavyweight Championship. He also would win the Australian Heavyweight Championship September 30th, 1911, from Jack Lester. He won the Colored World Heavyweight Championship February 20th, 1909. That was vacated by Jack Johnson, and 20-round scramble with Joe Jeanette. And like BL said, he fought Joe Jeanette a total of 3 times in 1 year, 1909, which is incredible. And that was between the fight and April 17th, 1909. He fought him 2 times before that, once before that and once after that, 20 rounds. So you have to look at a fighter like that. Say to yourself, my God, what's in this man to be able to pull something like that off? Unfortunately, he just didn't get the opportunity to go for a world title shot, but he made the best of what he had with the fighters that he was in the ring with. So you got to give Sam McVeigh all the credit in the world. Have him ranked number 5, as BL did as well.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I wholeheartedly agree with everything you said and agree with you gentlemen's ranking. I also have Sam McVeigh, number 5, the Oxnard Cyclone. This was a great fighter. He was a tank, but he was also clever. He showed the ability to adapt. So even though he was a ferocious knockout puncher, and really, the guys who didn't get knocked out were all-time greats at times, but he was absolutely vicious. But he showed in his fights with Sam Langford that he could give him trouble. And this was at a time when no one was giving Sam Langford trouble. So, because he was able to fight on the retreat with jabs and hooks, and Langford could close on anybody at this time. And so McVeigh showed that he was, in and around this fantastic schedule. Like, let me just pull up a graphic. Let me find this graphic just to illustrate a point for the uninitiated about what it was like in this time. Hold on a second. Sorry, folks. I'll pull this up while I find it. Sam Langford's 1911 was a carved path of destruction, but it was Sam McVeigh that got the best of him. How great was Sam McVeigh when he was fighting, one of the absolute all-time great pound-for-pound fighters in the history of pugilism? He was able to be competitive and get the best of him. They had a fantastic fight series. Sam McVeigh participated in, what's to me one of the, if not the greatest three-way heavyweight rivalry in boxing history. Is that something you guys might agree with?
Oh yeah, for sure.
No question about it.
Like they were kicking a lot of asses, but they were also in there with themselves. This is what I was looking for. This is 1 year. These three guys, this is their 1911. That's all the fights. Some of the fights were between themselves, and then other stuff. These guys were just traveling around, just kicking every ass they could find, and also fighting each other. You just don't see that today. I can't think of anything approaching this today. So this is what, for the uninitiated, this is what we're talking about when we talk about these guys get to be above these other guys, these other great fighters, because these other great fighters are not doing this. They're not doing this. So it's just remarkable. What a rich era this was. This is my favorite era to study, especially the path of these great fighters. So Sam McVeigh, yes, there are others above him, but what a phenomenal fighter. And, he booking a finish fight against Joe Jeanette is not something that even great fighters wanted to do. So the fight in Paris, that's probably the greatest title fight of all time. There's certainly a great argument for it. I mean, can you guys think of, is there a greater title fight? I know there have been other epic title fights, but is there one you can think
That's my number
of
one.
that's greater than 49 rounds? My goodness.
That's my number one, yeah.
Well, to give people an idea, those two fighters, Sam McVeigh and Joe Jeanette, at the Cirque de Paris, they fought more rounds in that one fight than Ali and Frazier did, adding all three of their fights added together.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because the thing with Sam McVeigh, they had to place a paper bag over his head because he literally could not breathe. It's like almost he was having a heart attack. He couldn't breathe. So they were using a paper bag to have him breathe. And they also threw buckets of water on Joe Jeanette's head. And the McVeigh camp was fussing, saying you can't do that, but there was nothing in the rule books. I mean, they would find every kind of way to revive each other just for that one more round. And to show what courageous that Joe Jeanette had in front of a man like Sam McVeigh to get up 27 times in that fight, and you don't know how much longer you have to go, a total of 32 knockdowns, it's incredible. That was some fight. I just happen to have it my greatest heavyweight championship fight of all times.
And if I can add before we go, just quickly before we go on, that fight as well, as Scrapbook will know, in the fight, McVeigh showed that ability, because sometimes he'd appear cautious and controlled, and then one of his main tactics in his boxing career is he would fight, he would be patient, he would look to pick his shots, and then all of a sudden, like in the April 1909 fight, you know, he came out for the first 2 or 3 rounds, you know, he's getting picked off a bit by Jeanette's jab, Jeanette's moving around, then say 4th round, McVeigh comes out, powers after him, unleashing power hook after power hook, chasing him down. Jeanette gets through round, he's been hurt. Then next round, McVeigh's cautious. You never knew what he was going to do, whether he was going to have a quiet round or whether he was going to sprint round coming at you right from first spell. He mixed it up. He never fought the same. You know, he mixed it up, and he would often fight 3 quiet rounds and have one insane round where he'd go after you, then have 2 quiet rounds, then launch another insane round. You know, he did the same with Harry Wilson, started to break him down. You know, very, very dangerous fighter. Like I said, added to that durability and that big punch and that stamina. What a frightening man to get in ring with, as Jack Johnson and others attested to.
That's right. And he fought at a schedule that's just unseen today, and among many of his contemporaries. And he was just vicious, but he was also very clever and remarkably tough. And he was much feared. People, you know, we say fear, it doesn't mean people are shaken, but people have a competition reluctance because they're like, well, I don't know about that. But he still, the guys who would get in there with him, they all felt the power. Like Sam McVeigh was something else. And I can't think of another heavyweight fight that I'm aware of where the 49 rounds they went in Paris in the context of busy years, like, because that was you know, they're all fighting lots of fights. They're beating up a bunch of guys, and they're having these great fights with each other. But in today, it would be stretched over years what they were doing in 1 year. So that, to me, that's greatness. Just like I gave Tommy Burns a lot of credit for being busy champion. These guys were fighting a crazy schedule. They weren't sitting around on social media talking stuff. They were fighting, training. They were helping other fighters train. They were sparring, you know, and traveling.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be like equivalent of Evander Holyfield and Riddick Bowe fighting 3 times in that 1 year, and they would have the exciting rounds that they've had all in 1 year. Imagine that. You just think about that. Imagine if they went 49 rounds. Oh, it's just amazing when you just put the context behind it. What these men actually went through in 1 year, fighting each other 3 times. 20 rounds was the least amount of rounds that they went. I mean, that's just really amazing. Really is.
Yeah, so definitely Sam McVeigh. When I think of greatness and I think of that quarter century, 1900, 1925, I couldn't put him lower than 5. Like he had to be the, and I'm sure you guys felt the same thing. You'd be like, well, hold on a minute. We're not going to put these other guys. You can't say the things about them you could say about the great Sam McVeigh. So yeah, full credit to him. What a fantastic fighter. And appropriate time for you to unveil your number 4, BL.
Well, yes, my number 4 is the other half in that April 1909 fight. My number 4 is Joe Jeanette, who was the winner of that fight, as famously quoted by Sam McVeigh when he come out and touched gloves in the middle of the ring before the start of 50th round. He said, Joe, I can't see you. You're the better man. And he touched gloves with Joe Jeanette. And Joe Jeanette, to me, has one of the hardest entrances in a boxing career I have seen. You know, in his first 23 professional fights, he has a whole fight series with Black Bill. He has a whole fight series with dangerous contender George Cole. He has a whole fight series with the Galveston Giant Jack Johnson. Loses most of those fights, also gains a 2nd round DQ win. From all the reports I've read, a lot of people said it looked a bit dubious how he hit him low, like he intended to hit him low, because he was already getting raked by Joe Jeanette's jab and long range sniping. Which didn't favour Johnson fighting a long-range sniping fight. Basically, from there, you know, a short time after that, he then beats Sam Langford himself. Now, Sam Langford had over 50 fights by this point. Langford was winning most of the first 4 rounds, but then Jeanette turned up the gear, okay, and started throwing multi-punch combinations to Langford's body, then mixing it up to head, and broke Langford down you know, and stopped him. Langford, you know, pulled out in his corner at the end of round 8. You know, when you look at his career going through, like Scrapbook mentioned, the fight series with Sam McVeigh, the fight series with Sam Langford, you know, well over a dozen fights. The fights I've mentioned there, fighting people like young Peter Jackson. I mean, in 1912 and 1913, you know, in 1912, when Langford and McVeigh were having their fight series in Australia under Hugh McIntosh, you know, Jeanette was, aside from Johnson, he was kind of the best heavyweight on American shores at that time. And in that time, he was trying to get a fight with Jack Johnson, and Jeanette were all over media doing interviews, calling Johnson a yellow belly. He was calling Johnson out for a fight and demanding Johnson give him a chance, and Johnson never did. And I always remember another quote by Jack Johnson, because I always think you can go to great fighters who fought fighters to know how good they are. And he actually said that, you know, when you're fighting Sam Langford, you have got to be ready for a hard fight. But when you're fighting Joe Jeanette, you've got to be even better prepared. Better prepared for Joe Jeanette than you have to be for Sam Langford. Jack Johnson actually said, although some people say it would have been a bit of a dig at Langford because Johnson and Langford didn't get on, but he actually said Joe Jeanette's twice as tough as Sam Langford. Johnson famously got caught out by that because he said, oh, Joe Jeanette will win that fight, but if he does beat he should fight Joe Jeanette, and if he can win, which he won't, then I'll give him a chance. And then Langford did beat Joe Jeanette, and Johnson didn't give him a chance. But Joe Jeanette, you know, from all those fights to having wins on there against Jeff Clark, fighting Harry Wills. Now, a lot of people don't realize, you know, Harry Wills basically was fought to 2 draws by Joe Jeanette, and this is at like 1914, around that period. He fought Harry Wills to 2 draws, and he was a coloured heavyweight champion, albeit for a short time. But even as high as 1915, he was still gaining wins over Sam Langford, you know, and he was still showing he was on a certain level. And that carried on even right up until like 1917, 1918, past his prime. He was still capable of fighting and handling either the top contenders or the elite fighters and giving a good account of himself, like in 1918 when he beat battling Jim Johnson, who was not the greatest heavyweight around, but he was a very, very tough heavyweight. In fact, the only win Harry Wills got over Joe Jeanette was towards the end of 1919, when Jeanette was well past his prime. Prior to that, Harry Wills had not been able to beat Joe Jeanette in 2 previous attempts, whereas he had beat fighters like McVeigh and Langford. So Jeanette, for me, was a very skilled boxer. He had damage to his right arm. His wife had to adjust all of his suits by about an inch and a half, which is why he developed a very cultured left hand. He was a great jabber. He could move around the ring well. He was extremely durable. You know, people question his knockout power, but I always say, you know, he's got way more knockouts than Marciano has fights. And Joe Jeanette has knocked out more than his fair share of opponents. He beat Georges Carpentier, of course. That was in France. You know, so a great fighter with a great resume, a huge number of major fights on there against many elite fighters of his time. And even though he didn't win them all, the elite fighters he fought knew one thing for sure, that they were in for a hard night when they got in that ring with him. You know, regardless of, you know, who they were, they knew when they got in ring with him, it was going to be a long, hard night. And I think that's a great testament to him, and that's why I have Joe Jeanette number 4.
What a fantastic tribute. Scrapbook, would you like to unveil your number 4?
Yeah, I don't know if this is against the rules, but I'm going to actually, you tell me if it's against the rules or not. I'm going to switch my number 4 that I had, Joe Jeanette number 6. I'm putting him at number 4. And
I have no problem with that.
The man I had number 4 is going to number 6. I don't even know why, but he was Jack Dempsey. So I have Joe Jeanette number 4, and I already talked about him. So that's who my number 4 is, Joe Jeanette.
Yeah, that's perfectly fair. That's perfectly fair. I'm so much enjoying this conversation. I hope the listeners are. Thanks again, people, for tuning in live or afterwards. Yeah, would you like to talk about Dempsey a little bit, and then maybe even talk a little bit more about Jeanette? That's fine. We got time to celebrate these great fighters.
Sure. Jack Dempsey, he was a very, very good fighter during his time. the issue that I have with Jack Dempsey is you can't stop a certain people from having an opportunity at something that you own that's worldwide. The crown everybody deserves a chance at the crown. And when you prevent them from getting a shot, you take the legacy away from them, whether they win or they lose. That I have a problem with. For that reason is why I had to move him. Now, as far as his career is concerned, yes, he was in there with Fireman Flynn twice, Willie Mean 4 times, Bob McAllister, Gunboat Smith, Carl Gene Tunney twice. He fought a guy by the name of John Lester Johnson, who cracked his ribs in 1916. And it was things like that as to why he was saying, no, I'm not going to, But my biggest problem was with him was in 1924. He violated a contract with Harry Wills. The contract was actually written in stone, and he didn't do it. So they kicked him out of New York. He can no longer fight in New York. And it was interesting. He opened up the Garden with Bill Brennan in New York. So the fact that happened with Jack Dempsey is why I have an issue with him. Other than that, he was a very good fighter. I do love to fight with him. When he fought a man in 1921, I think it was like 9 knockdowns. He went out of the ring, and it was a very interesting fight. But I got to tell you, Jack Dempsey, you just disappointed me, and I think he disappointed the boxing community. When you look at it in today's standards, that's why I have an issue with Jack Dempsey. Can't take away from his ability, but if you're going to be in my top 10, you have to meet all the criteria, and he didn't meet all the criteria, and that's why I had to move him.
Can I just add something there to what Scrapbook said? Okay, because he's raised a good point, and I mentioned it earlier with Jack Dempsey. One of my main issues with him, it's not only that he didn't fight fighters like Godfrey. Kid Norfolk were furiously calling out Dempsey, as was Harry Wills. Harry Wills were pursuing him. There were polls done, public polls where newspapers in many different states all put these polls in the papers, and then what people did is they ticked the boxes, posted it in the post boxes, then they were collated across multiple states, about who Dempsey's next opponent should be. Harry Wills won by getting about 4 times more votes than second place Tommy Gibbons. Dempsey then fought Tommy Gibbons. Okay, it's not only that, but it's other things, okay, that really irritate me. Point one is he said that he basically drew the colour line, but he had no problem having Big Bill Tate as his chief sparring partner, a black fighter. Another thing, he drew the colour line, but also didn't mind taking his brother when he was ill to see a black doctor. And then it's also other things like, when he'd not drawn the colour line at one point, because he'd flit in and out of colour line as it suited him. Okay, so this here time, Wills is pursuing him, and then Dempsey comes out in this newspaper interview and says, "Oh, yes, I'm letting you know now, I'm drawing the colour line." And then he says, "Well, now I've drawn the colour line, I can say that Harry Wills is a great fighter and could probably beat any fighter on his day." It's like, well, why are you saying that in the same interview after you've just said you've drawn the colour line? Why are you not saying that before you've drawn the colour line? That is using the colour line as a defence against Harry Wills. So it's all these different things, plus the fighters he didn't fight, that really aggravate me about that situation. And me personally, I think Dempsey was a great fighter. He let his career down. He let his legacy down. I think he could have knocked out Kid Norfolk potentially. He potentially could have beaten George Godfrey. I think the Wills fight were very dangerous for him. But, I think even if he'd have lost to Wills, he'd give a good account of himself. But my point is that he should have took those fights. Okay, he should have took those fights for his own legacy. Okay, and he didn't. And just about what Scrapbook was saying there, I'm very venomous on this point, because I don't like the fact that it's a bit like Langford in the early 1900s. I remember reading a newspaper article with a guy saying that, well, too many fighters are drawing the colour line because they're scared of Sam Langford. And I think that, I think a number of times Dempsey drew the colour line because he wasn't keen on fighting fighters who were chasing him. And that's sad. And that's why I said on my list, Dempsey's number 6 and can't go any higher.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing, and because when because we can all acknowledge like he was great, but not everything about him was great. And there are
Yeah,
other,
if I can say one last thing, if you don't mind,
please,
on
please.
this topic here. Uh, Jack Dempsey, another thing with him, he told Harry Wells when he was making a comeback, Jack Dempsey was making a comeback because he was out for 2 years. He told Harry Wells, okay, I'm coming back, but I need you to take on Louis Angel Firpo. Now, Louis Angel Firpo was the fighter that I was talking about that went 2 rounds. And each man, it was like a total of 9 knockdowns. And Jack Dempsey went out of the ring. Well, he said to Harry Wells, if you take on Louis Angel Firpo, you defeat him, then I will give you a shot. So Harry Wells took on Louis Angel Firpo. He knocked down Louis Angel Firpo twice, and it went the distance to a draw, which meant it wasn't a victory for Wells. And that allowed Jack Dempsey to decide to go on and face Gene Tunney. And I just thought that was unfair that he would do something like that. The other thing was he was a referee for a Harlem middleweight amateur fighter who won the North American AAU amateur middleweight championship. And when that fight was over, he raised the hand of this young man and said, this young man hits like a muse kick. And if he decides to turn middleweight or even light heavyweight, I can't see him losing to anyone. That young man's name was the Harlem Thunderbolt, Harry Smith. He had a record of 55-0 with 50 knockouts. And it just goes to show he recognized opportunities that these young men could have, but refused to give it to them. He would give them credit in conversations, but he didn't give them the opportunities they so justly deserve. So I have an issue with Jack Dempsey, and it's unfortunately for him that he didn't secure his legacy that way. He ruined his legacy, as far as I'm concerned, by not giving all fighters opportunities.
Yeah, I struggled with some of these, like, because he was, for a time there, he was a beast, but then it's how people carry themselves. But it's hard to balance giving credit for greatness and then understanding their limitations. So yeah, these top tens could all come, probably depending on how we felt that day, could have possibly, the lower part could have come out. We might actually agree on the top, on the very, very top here. But yeah, Dempsey was great, but he definitely didn't carve out in the actual fighting and promoting like the health of the sport. Like making money was good, but that was a time when lots of people could have been making lots of money if more opportunities were given at that world level. But on his way up, he did a tremendous amount of work. So that's why I had him in the list. Like some certain other fighters, it's not just what they do when they get to the top, it's how they get to the top. And so, yeah, it's a balanced thing. But Scrap, you said you were going to put Jeanette, which I think is righteous, at 4. Would you like to just talk a little bit more about him?
Sure. Joe Jeanette, what I really respect about him, he was a class man. You know, he married a beautiful wife. He had a beautiful family. He was a very classy man. And I respected him a great deal because of that. But the men he was in the ring with, here's a man who didn't really have amateur experience other than the fight in the street, but he came up the hard way and he gave it everything he had. He won the colored title because that was the opportunities that he had. He won the Australian heavyweight championship belt. So he did everything that he could possibly do in order to, you know, be considered a great fighter, but he just wasn't given the opportunity. The Australian heavyweight championship belt was Sam McVeigh, so I have to strike that. But he was an outstanding fighter. So Joe Jeanette, I think he needs to be in everyone's top 10 at least. If you really break down what he has done and look at all the criteria, I can't see how he couldn't be. But I just have a special space in my heart for Joe Jeanette, the Iron Man, West Hoboken, New Jersey. Unbelievable fighter he was. No question about it.
Fantastic. So I think it's my turn, and I had Joe Jeanette number 4. I struck between him and McVeigh. They were both so great in, like I said before, in such a rich era. But Jeanette had a larger career, and you know, so he ended up nudging for 4. And what a great fighter he was. And his, like you had mentioned, I think BL, his first 23 fights is. I had a video I was working on. I need to finish that out and put it up. But I had a video I was working on. His first 23 fights is like such a remarkable run. Like he's practically a rookie, separate from like his bare knuckles stuff that he had been doing, but is in the professional, in the on the books. You know, he's fighting a prime Jack Johnson so early in his career, multiple times. That's, you know, because Johnson, before the great Jack Johnson got his world title shot in 1908, he'd been one of the top guys for years. You gentlemen have both done great content on that, like on his ascension to the world, quote unquote, the establishment title. But like Jack Johnson's career was magnificent, and Jeanette was one of the people who was really like, he was bathed in fire to start his career, his professional career, and he became this one of the all-time greats. So I had to have him. I had to have him number 4, and he was, because he was mixing in with the highest frequency, with the highest company. And there's just a handful of fighters from, you know, that are on these lists where you can absolutely say, you know, the you know, I don't want to give anything away. I don't even know if it would be a surprise to the regulars, but yeah, you guys have done wonderful tribute to Joe Jeanette. But like, I'm just say his endurance, like nobody really wanted to fight him in a finish fight. And so that's why I give him and McVeigh so much credit, you know, 49 rounds. But like you said, they had fought 20 rounds prior and they had fought 30 rounds later that year. And they both had busy years separate from that. The level of greatness that these gentlemen were achieving in fighting, not in money, not in crowd size, or although they were heavily covered, they made not enough for the effort, but they made money compared to others. But the greatness they radiated in fighting and martial arts, competitive martial arts, it's very hard to put anyone in that select upper group. But both of these gentlemen absolutely had to be in there. And you know, there are other fighters who are great, but who avoid matchups, avoid competition too heavily to rank above guys like this, who are willing to put it all out there. And people were avoiding them, but they were still getting in great fights because lots of people were being avoided. They were all fighting each other, and then other guys who may have been more famous or had establishment titles at times were having easier schedules than they did. So I'm here ranking greatness. I'm not ranking business sense. And so that's why Joe Jeanette made my number 4. Now we're down to 3. Hardline, is it time for your number 3, sir?
Yeah, just give me a second, buddy.
Sure thing.
Sorry, I've just had to get another drink. I've just had an insane coughing fit. Just at listeners, I have got COVID-19 a minute, so I hope I'm doing okay. Right, so my number 3, I really had an argument, okay, in my head between number 2 and 3, because they're both great heavyweights in their own way. But in the end, I elected to go with my gut feeling, okay, and my gut feeling for number 3 is actually Harry Wills, the Black Panther. To me, one of the most underrated heavyweight fighters of all time. Namely, the reason I say he's underrated is because very few people even mention him, except people like us. You know, people call Riddick Bowe a great heavyweight. People call Vitaly Klitschko a great heavyweight. People call Max Schmeling a great heavyweight. Many of these same people never mention Harry Wills, who was a 3-time coloured heavyweight champion. He had over 30 fights for that coloured heavyweight title. He made 25 defences in 3 reigns of that coloured heavyweight title. You know, from his earlier fights with McVeigh, the 5 fights he had with McVeigh, you know, the early fights with Jeanette and then the later win over Jeanette, the fight series with Langford, where he did fight Langford, still more in his prime, 1914 into 1915, Langford was still capable. You know, the results were mixed. Langford famously knocked him out twice. Wills also beat Langford at other times. Then, as time went on, it got to like 1917, Harry Wills started really in his stride, in his early prime, and he became a dominant force, okay, and until early 20s, he was almost unbeatable, from destroying Ole Anderson, knocking down Denver Ed Martin 6 times in 1 round, you know, to destroying Fred Fulton in 3 rounds was such a brutal shot to finish it. They actually said that Fred Fulton's shoulders hit the floor before his ass did. Destroying Gunboat Smith in Gunboat's last fight. Gunboat on end of one of those deadly left hooks with the opposing hand as to what Fred Fulton hit. You were talking about as you know, his size is debated. I've seen him at 6'2.5", 6'3", 6'3.5", 6'4". So call him 6'3.5" as an average. You know, we're talking about a 6'3.5" heavyweight to 6'4" heavyweight. You know, from like 200 pounds earlier in his career, he bulked up eventually to like 230 pounds. Long raking puncher, power in both hands, a clever fighter, a tricky fighter. You know, in some of the later fights where Langford going 1916, 1917, you know, Harry Wills was able to start dominating Langford using his range, you know, fighting using his abilities. You know, against Kid Norfolk when he knocked him out, against others, he showed great infighting skills. You know, many people said we didn't even see the shot. We just saw Norfolk fall like a tree had been felled. You know, it was a short clipping right hook on the inside, but he were able to deliver maximum power. And over those years from 1917 until early 20s, Harry Wills was like an imperious heavyweight. He was looking almost unbeatable, a wrecking machine, destroying fighter after fighter. You know, Jeff Clark famously struggling to survive the distance in one of their fights when Wills were in sensational form, could barely get punches off. He were having to defend himself so intensely. I think in Harry Wills, we have a fighter with an misunderstood resume. People say, well, he did fight Langford a lot after his prime, you know, in 1917, 1918. That Sam Langford was still a capable fighter. You know, some people say, well, he was past his prime. Well, he must have been like a punching bag then. No, he was still a capable fighter. Langford was still scoring many knockouts after that time. He wasn't in his prime, okay? But even towards the end of Langford's prime, you know, Will still gained a few wins against Langford then. Obviously, when he hit his prime and Langford passed his prime, Langford could no longer keep up with him because Wills was just too good. But Harry Wills is one of the most underrated heavyweight fighters of all time. I've always raved that he's a greater heavyweight than Vitali. He's a greater heavyweight than Riddick Bowe. He's a greater heavyweight than many heavyweights. He just doesn't get the accolades, you know, because of mainly Jack Dempsey and his public clamour that were around Dempsey at the time. The fact, like Scrapbook and I have mentioned, he didn't get the opportunities he should have got. I mean, famously, he challenged to come down and spar Dempsey when he was challenged. Well, if you think you can fight him, and at first he turned it down and said, "No, I don't want to spar him because I can beat him and Willard in one night." Because that was kind of man he was. But he was also a very dignified man. He was well dressed. He was intelligent. He was smart. You know, he was just a well. He kind of conducted himself in a professional manner. You know, even to a point, I read an interview in 1923, I believe it was, with Harry Wills. And Harry Wills, and this, you know, as more the American viewers will understand, but Harry Wills said that even in the South, he was seeming to be paid a lot more respect than what he used to get in his earlier career. And in the South, as you guys know at that time, you know, it was like a horrendous place for certain communities. So for Harry Wills to say that, you know, oh, I seem to be even getting a grudging respect in the South, is testament to how he conducted himself and what kind of fighter he was. Total professional.
Fantastic. Scrapbook, I believe it's time for your turn.
Yes, mine's is Jack Johnson, and I'm going to explain why in a moment. Jack Johnson has 17 colored title heavyweight championship defenses. He was a 6'1.5" with a 74-inch reach Texan. He was from Galveston. He had close to 100 fights. And here's a man who, if you know his story, what he came from, he actually made it out of all of those fighters that we talked about. He was the first black heavyweight champion in boxing history, 1908, when he would defeat Noah Busso, Tommy Burns. He was in the ring with George Byers in his third professional fight. Frank Childs, he was stopped in 3 rounds by Joe Jawinski, February 25th, 1901. You know, he's very underrated as a heavyweight. we also have to remember the time in which he came, the things he got away with. He was very humble. He felt that he belonged, and he demanded that he get the respect everyone else got. You're looking at a fighter who was in there with Homer Smith, Tom Caller, Bearcat Wright, and Jack Thompson. He fought Stanley Ketchel and Frank Krauser, Al Kaufman, and Frank Moran, battling Jim Johnson and fireman Jim Smith, Joe Jeanette, Bill Lang, Bob Fitzsimmons, Black Bill, Sam Langford, Mexican Pete Everett, George Gardner, Hank Griffin, Denver Ed Martin, Sandy Ferguson, Marvin Hart. He was in the ring with Joe Jeanette 10 times, excuse me. He fought the great Sam Langford. He was one of the greatest defensive fighters of all times. He lost to Jess Willard in 1915 in the 26th round. But Joe Jeanette, who I believe should have gotten that opportunity with Jack Johnson and Sam Langford for the heavyweight championship belt, Jack Johnson gave it to Jim Johnson. But Jack Johnson overall was an outstanding heavyweight during his time, great fighter, a defensive wizard, learned a lot from Joe Jawinski when he was in prison with him. He finally would take on the Boilermaker, Jim Jeffries, in 1910. We go 15 rounds with him. He would stop him in that last round. And there were riots all over the place, because they couldn't see Jack Johnson do what he did. He could have been assassinated right there in that ring. But his honor was, I'm the heavyweight champion. I give all men shots at titles. And I'm going to go with the fight. He had so many death threats the night before that fight in Reno, Nevada. So when you add everything up with Jack Johnson, I can't deny him. But I got him ranked number 3. Greatest heavyweight during the time of 1900, 1925.
What a fantastic tribute. Yeah, he's someone who definitely overcame a lot of adversity in his career. He came up from nothing and became world famous and, an iconic, person in the boxing realm and in sports history. Yeah, definitely. I struggled with the uppermost of this entire list, especially this position. I had a fierce debate. BL, you said you did. I had a fierce debate with myself between number 3 and number 2. In the end, I ended up going with, for my number 3, I went with great Black Panther or Brown Panther. He was known as both. Harry Wills, who to me was doing the work that the supposed world champs were supposed to be doing during his prime. He was doing the work they were supposed to be doing, defending their belt. He was doing it. He was fighting the guys. So I give him tremendous respect. He was adaptable. He learned the game. He just got thrown into a fire pit as far as like his level of competition, and it turned him into a great fighter. He fought in a rich era. He fought a great schedule, and so yeah, I had to give him that. I had to give him that respect, and like looking at him compared to Dempsey. Well, who was willing to, for me? Like if I'm just talking greatness, not measuring someone's bank account, although Wills did make money in his career. But who was greater? Well, to me, he was certainly greater because he was fighting the guys that you would want to see. Johnson for the later part of his title reign and Willard and Dempsey. You want to see them fighting the guys that Harry Wills was fighting and doing very well against. So tremendous respect to him. But as we get, trying to narrow it down to 10 people with just a floating criteria, I'm still struggling now in my head, but I'm going to just stay with that, what I had it coming into the conversation. And I think, BL, would you like to present your number 2 heavyweight of the first quarter of the century.
Yes. And the other person I had the major argument with, Harry Wills, I settled into second place, was Scrapbook's number 3, Jack Johnson, the Galveston Giant. A few things on Jack Johnson. Scrapbook touched on the fact that Johnson didn't always get recognised for by many, that he was one of the great defensive fighters of all time, one of the greatest defensive heavyweight fighters of all time, for sure. And another thing that Jack Johnson doesn't get respect for is his just overall ring generalship. You know, we're talking about a guy who was a great infighter, very clever infighter, would tie you up cleverly on the inside, get his own shots off, leave you a little room to get your own shots off. He was also a great judge of distance. He could time you with like lead left hooks, right uppercuts. As you close distance on him, he'd time and hit you with punishing, jolting shots, you know, left hooks, right uppercuts, straight rights. Just a master ring general. You know, I'm trying to imagine what it was like for those fighters trying to cut the ring off against Jack Johnson. He appeared not to be able to get cornered. He knew how to use every foot of that ring to his advantage. And it was a bit like Scrap mentioned, he learned a lot from Joe Choinski. I always remember Joe Choinski saying, you know, if this kid learns balance and footwork, he's going to be something else. And, you know, Joe Choinski were right. Jack Johnson did learn those things and became one of the most sensational fighters. I mean, Scrapbook's already kind of gone through a lot of his roster, you know, but even back then, fighting Denver Ed Martin, he became coloured heavyweight champion against him in 1903. He then went on to have an entire reign as coloured heavyweight champion and was unbeaten. You know, when he won the world heavyweight title, the coloured heavyweight title was considered dropped by Johnson, but he was an undefeated coloured heavyweight champion. Then he became the established heavyweight champion, as I call it. I don't call it the world heavyweight champion general. I call it the established heavyweight title. And basically, you know, he then went unbeaten for that for many years until losing to Jess Willard. So over the 2 reigns for the 2 titles, he held the coloured heavyweight title and the established heavyweight title. You know, he only ever suffered 1 title fight loss in there. Okay, and that was in the final fight to Jess Willard. It is a shame, you know, that the proposed fight in Cuba in 1916 between Jack Johnson and the new rising heavyweight star Harry Wills did not come off. That was a big shame. I would have been fascinated to see what happened in that fight had it happened in, I think they were planning it for Havana in 1916, but it didn't come off. Negotiations didn't work out. But basically, Jack Johnson really had already fought many great fighters. Yeah, he fought Sam McVeigh early in his career, but he still beat him 3 times. Yeah, he fought Jeanette a whole number of times early in his career, but he still was gaining most of the wins against him. He did beat Sam Langford. It was a coloured heavyweight title defence. Langford was at 156. Johnson were at 185. So Johnson had a big advantage. Langford still hurt him a few times in round 4, round 10, noticeably. And in the last few rounds, we're getting closer to Johnson and starting to land cleaner shots. But Johnson put a licking on Langford in that fight in a lot of those rounds. You know, and from there, even beating fighters like former coloured champions, you know, like Joe Butler. You know, he beat Frank Childs. As Scrapbook mentioned, the fight series with Hank Griffin, who was a very dangerous puncher at that time. He was a heavy-handed guy. And when you go through his entire career, Jack Johnson has fought, including the more established title fights with Philadelphia Jack O'Brien's and Ketchell's, and destroying Jim Jeffries when he came back, albeit after a long layoff, you know, beating fireman Jim Flaines, Frank Moran's, etc. You know, he has a fantastic resume for what he did. It is a shame he didn't give Langford, Jeanette McVeigh, you know, those shots at the title, but they didn't happen. Okay, you know, he'd already fought them, so in a way, you know, unlike Dempsey, who never gave those guys a shot, you know, Jack Johnson had already beaten those guys, and some of them had beaten them multiple times. So due to the fact we're talking about one of the greatest heavyweight technicians, a great boxing general, and the fact he was unbeaten coloured heavyweight champion and established heavyweight champion for a total sum going, you know, over a decade for both titles, you know, it is incredible considering his opposition. So yeah, those are some of the reasons why I have Jack Johnson number 2.
Very nice, very fitting tribute. Like a lot of boxers, he has a complicated legacy that isn't always readily apparent. If you just see a documentary on him, they'll talk about certain aspects. But yeah, he was a very special fighter. Everyone on these lists we've come up with were very special in their own ways. Scrap, I believe we're at your number 2, sir.
Yeah, I want to applaud BL for that conversation. It was a great conversation he just had in his number 2 pick. And I got to
thank you, Scrapbook.
absolutely.
I'm trying my best, buddy. I'm not 100%, but I'm trying my best.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I do. I got to tell you something. I got Harry Wells number 2. And the reason why I have him number 2 over Jack Johnson is because Jack Johnson never gave Sam Langford his second opportunity that was promised to Sam Langford. And Harry Wells fought Sam Langford 22 times. Here's a man who was a 3-time colored heavyweight champion, had over 30 colored heavyweight championship defenses. He was in the ring with Joe Jeanette, July 1st, 1913. To October 20th, 1919, 3 times. He was in the ring with Jeff Clark, June 18th, 1913. June 17th, 1922, 9 times. 8 wins and 1 draw. As I stated, Sam Langford, 22 times, between May 4th, 1914 and January 17th, 1922. Big Bill Tate, 6 times, between November 11th, 1916 and January 6th, 1922. 4 wins, 1 loss, and 1 draw. He was in the ring with Kid Norfolk 1 time, March 2nd, 1922. 2nd round knockout, New York's Madison Square Garden. And 1922 was one of the greatest years in all of boxing. I mean, here you have a man named Harry Greb defeats Gene Tunney. It's only defeat. Sam Langford knocks out Theodore Tiger Flowers. You have Benny Leonard and Jack Britton. George Compartier loses his crown to Balansiki. So many great fights happened in 1922. Harry Greb took out Kid Norfolk. He was in the ring with Homer Smith, 1923. Sam McVeigh, December 20th, 1914. September 8th, 1920. Fought them both at the St. Nicholas Arena. And that used to be an ice skating palace. It's on 66th Street and Broadway in Manhattan. George Kid Cotton and John Lester Johnson. You name them. If given an opportunity, he was in the ring with them. Unfortunately, he didn't get the opportunity with Jack Dempsey. But Harry Wells, the Brown Panther, is my pick for number 2. Greatest heavyweight during the years of 1900, 1925.
Yeah, Scrapbook. I'll just quickly jump in and say, yeah, great breakdown. I actually, as I mentioned, I had a real argument for number 3 and number 2, and I settled on Wills 3 and Johnson 2. But originally, I did put Harry Wills 2nd and Johnson 3rd. I changed my mind since then. But you know, these fighters are all so great. It's sometimes hard to pick between them. But yeah, do you agree with me? Wills does go very underrated, doesn't he? When you're talking boxing circles about great heavyweights, so many people seem to not include him in things. It's quite tragic, really.
Yeah, they don't seem to understand him, and they don't understand his career, and they don't understand the circumstances that followed him. At the end of his career, he owned houses in Harlem, New York. Very intelligent man. And you would find him in Grubb's Gym on 116th Street in Harlem, along with some of the great fighters during that time. They'd be sitting in there and they would be, you know, giving instructions and some tips to some of the great fighters that were up and coming, such as Ray Robinson, Danny Cox, and Louis Spider Valentine, and many others. But yes, Harry Wells is very underrated. They don't quite seem to understand the time in which he came and the circumstances that surrounded him. I agree.
Yeah, what a fantastic fighter. And I think partly the reason is like I like to watch like the various boxing documentaries from over the years that are now available on YouTube, which is wonderful for fans. Just find them. They're just right there. But they often sort of like in this time, because, you know, Johnson and Willard, they weren't fighting that often. So they kind of skip over it, like, nothing much happened. But this was an incredibly rich time for heavyweight boxing. And so things were charging ahead, even surrounding like the occasional title fight. And Wills did just a ridiculous amount of work. What a great fighter. It's wonderful to be able to hear people celebrate him, because he does go, people kind of leave him out of the equation. They say, this guy's great, that guy's great. It's like, well, what about Harry Wills? He was immeasurably great. He was cheated out of some opportunity, but he still got the work in, because a lot of guys were being robbed of opportunity. Just like Jeanette and McVeigh, they still got a lot of work in. They were still fighting. They were fighting more of the top guys than the champions were at times. So huge respect to this. It's definitely not just about titles, but he did, as the color champion, he did have a remarkable record. So I struggled myself with between 3 and 2, between Wills and Johnson. I ended up going with Wills in 3, Johnson at 2, but it could, each time you guys talk, you're persuading me one for the other. So, but I went for my number 2. I went with the great Jack Johnson, Little Arthur, and he was a brilliant stylist. He went through hell to get a world title shot. He fought a remarkable level of competition over his career. He's most celebrated for winning the world title. He was basically like an actual undisputed champion, as in he was the color champion. He was like the champion of the guys getting screwed out of title shots. And then he beat the establishment champion, Tommy Burns. He got the short end of the purse. Burns agreed. I think he got like 30,000. And Johnson probably got like $5,000 or something. I can't remember exactly, but he did not get an equal share. And he was supposed to fight Sam Langford in England. He borrowed the money to get out there to Australia to chase Burns. But, the sum of his career, I had to give between him and Wills, very close. I should have just done a tie and had them share it, but it wouldn't have worked for the format. I've been torn about this whole thing. I can't even remember what my list was. I'd have to go look at my notes, because you guys are bringing up so many great fighters. But yeah, Jack Johnson, he was actually undisputed, although it didn't last for very long, because he then wouldn't fight the top contenders. But he did fight some great fighters. He fought some powerful fighters as champ, but he wasn't necessarily fighting all of the most dangerous heavyweights. Although Al Kaufman, to his credit, was one of the top guys. He did fight him, so he was given opportunity out, but the only black fighter he would give a title shot to was battling Jim Johnson, who, of the group of top black fighters, he was stylistically could be exploited. Johnson was too clever for that. I guess he got hurt in the fight, and it was actually competitive, but he wasn't fighting one of the top killers. But we see that in the Alphabet era. Guy says, it's a title defense. He's ranked number 10 in one of these sanctioning bodies. And it's like, but is he really inside 10 in the whole world at that? Or is it just he's in the fringe of a sanctioning body who doesn't have all the top fighters in their pool? So, Johnson did tremendous work, and I had to give him his respect, as well as Harry Wills. I mean, these guys it blows my mind. He came from nothing and made himself a world famous, and managed to do the work. His contendership was epic. I say contendership for the establishment title, but as a color champion, he was, like you said, BL, he was fantastic. I'm still unsure about number 3 and number 2, but I'll just let it sit, like I said, as I had it when I came into the conversation. And I believe that closes out all but our number 1. And BL, you get to take the lead on this, my friend.
Well, my number 1 heavyweight, 1900 to 1925. How do I start this off? I'll say that my number 1, has a bigger heavyweight resume than Tommy Burns, than Billy Misk, than Jack Dempsey, than Sam McVeigh, than Harry Wills, than Jack Johnson. My number 1 heavyweight of this era has a bigger heavyweight resume than all of those fighters, when some of those fighters are pretty much career heavyweights. But my fighter started at featherweight stroke lightweight. My number 1 is Sam Langford. I rate him as the greatest heavyweight from 1900 1925. The reason for that, the few things before I talk about his main career is, he was a small fighter who I'm still hunting for the reported featherweight fight in 1902, which will confirm he did indeed fight at featherweight. But whether it's featherweight or lightweight, he basically was a small fighter who came up through the weights and fought a bigger heavyweight resume than both Harry Wills and Jack Johnson. He had a near 170 fight heavyweight resume, which is nearly 3 times the size of heavyweight resume that Muhammad Ali has. It's a bigger heavyweight resume, than Muhammad Ali, Riddick Bowe, and Evander Holyfield added together. Okay, this is the kind of heavy resume we're talking about. Now, the fact he fought such a big heavyweight resume as a smaller man is also coupled by the fact that as a smaller man, he was able to maintain his punch power and knock out heavyweights, sometimes with single shots. Okay, now what you got to think is a small fighter coming up in weight is one thing, but like we've seen with Pacquiao and Roberto Duran to an extent, they moved up an amount of weight, but often knockouts start drying out. Langford could maintain that knockout power even at heavyweight, which is frightening. Coupled to that fact, he was also a five-time coloured heavyweight champion, had, okay, over 50 fights for the coloured heavyweight title in 5 reigns, made 41 coloured heavyweight title defences as a former featherweight stroke lightweight. You know, what you were talking about, coupled with the insane fight runs against Jeanette and McVeigh and Wills, the earlier loss to Jack Johnson, you know, the epic fight series he had, you know, with Jim Flynn battling Jim Johnson, you know, Jeff Clark, you know, added to all those other names. Sam Langford not only has the second biggest heavyweight resume on my list of 10 fighters, he's also got the deepest in case of names. No one else on my top 10 can match the list of names that Sam Langford has fought and the amount of fights against them. To me, he is the greatest fighter from 1900 to 1925.
Absolutely. Scrapbook.
I couldn't agree with BL more than the way he broke that down. Incredible breakdown. And I have him also number one. I have him number one fighter of all times. Because of what he has done, the time in which he came, the men that he fought, the weights that he came from, featherweight all the way up to heavyweight, the criteria. Here's a young man who was abused at his household, came over at the age of 14 years old, no mother, no father, found a gym and started his career. He could have went the way, but he didn't. And he stuck with it. And he fought the great fighters, Joe Jeanette 14 times, Jack Johnson once, Jack Blackburn 6 times, Sam McVeigh 15 times, battling Jim Johnson 15 times, defeating him 11 times, 1 draw, no contest. And that's the same man who Jack Johnson gave a title to, opportunity for his heavyweight championship belt. Jeff Clark 11 times, Jack Thompson, Fred Fulton, George Godfrey, Clem Johnson, Joe Gans, Joe Walcott, Tiger Flowers, Dave Holly 4 times, Jim Flynn 4 times, knocked him out 1 time, stretched him out to the point where you didn't know whether this man was breathing or not. I mean, here's a man who was 5'7", who had a very long arm reach and used every bit of it, who would knock you out with either hand, walk forward to you in a straight line, was able to block, parry, and slip punches with bigger men, body and head. He was an incredible, incredible fighter. I can't think of who he didn't fight or who he wouldn't fight. He challenged Gene Tunney. He challenged Jack Dempsey. He challenged Marvin Hart. He challenged the twin Sullivan brothers and never got those opportunities.
Billy Papke as well.
Billy Papke, absolutely, absolutely. He fought Stanley Ketchel, and he won 6 rounds. It was supposed to be a no decision, and the next fight opportunity would have been a title shot. Unfortunately for Stanley Ketchel, he was shot and killed by Walter Dipley. So Sam Langford never got that second opportunity with Stanley Ketchel. But here's a man who did it all. And to the point where he got into the ring in 25, he couldn't see his opponent. And when the bell rings, I can't see him. And he walked out. He gave you every bit that he had, so he couldn't do it anymore. I have him ranked number 1 along with BL. And I'm sure I have him number 1 with you, Random, as well. Great, great fighter.
Absolutely. I mean, he debuted in 1902, and I guess his last known fight was in 26, but he was pretty inactive his last couple of years. So for this time period, it's very useful. But like even all time, I mean, his heavyweight resume is ridiculous, and his non-heavyweight resume is ridiculous. He fought up the weights, and because he was willing to fight so far above his weight, he was a terror across several weights in a way that just doesn't really come up in boxing history to where people are that feared, where the fearless are given pause. Guys like Stanley Catchell, who fought Jack Johnson, right? But his management only wanted a short fight, 6 rounds in against Langford. They seemed hesitant for the long fight. There's conflicting reports at that time. There were already like press wars by that time, reporting different myth and rumor to push an agenda. So, but Langford fought everybody who was willing to fight him, and he earned the nickname Begging Sam because as one of his many nicknames, because he wanted to fight everyone. He could keep the schedule. He was immeasurably tough and stayed in good shape. It was very rare for him to come in a little heavy in a fight. It did happen a couple times after he got back from Australia. He mid-career, I guess you could say, he had a couple fights where he came in a little light, but he was still capable of whipping himself back into superb shape. Like he lost to Gunboat Smith. People thought he took him lightly. Same thing with Jim Flynn, but in the return matches, he put horrific beatings on those men. Like in Gunboat's case, one of his fights, he said Langford basically ruined him. He actually explicitly said he ruined me. But Langford was like a terror.
Yeah, if I could add another little point on this as well, though.
Oh, please do.
Well, 2 little points. Point 1 is Sam Langford also beat, sometimes better, many of the fighters Johnson fought in his title reign. Okay, many of fighters Johnson fought in his title reign, Langford had already fought and beat them. You know, whether it's a Tony Ross, a Jack O'Brien, Fireman Jim Flynn. Langford also beat these fighters that Johnson then fought. But another really incredible thing about Sam Langford that a lot of people don't recognize, how many times now watching, that's a great pick, Langford and Philadelphia, Jack O'Brien. But how many times do we hear now, oh, this fighter is fighting, this guy is 15 pounds heavier, oh, the big guy's leaning on him. After 6 or 7 rounds, small guy's going to be sapped of energy, he's not going to have any strength left. You know, we hear that when Klitschko used to arm lean on back of fighters' necks and, oh, it's going to tire him out, he won't be able to carry on for long because he's going to get sapped of energy. And here we have a small fighter, okay, fighting many giant fighters, and they were trying to lean on him. They were trying to use the physical strength and impose on him, like battling Jim Johnson there. He was like 6'3", he could weigh up to 240 pounds. He was an aggressive, mauling type fighter who used to like to throw you around on inside. He'd club you with punches, he'd tie you up and wrestle you to sap your strength. You know, Langford could fight these big fighters, but he could fight them for 15 or 20 rounds. You know, he wasn't tired after 8 rounds because they were leaning on back of his neck. He's a very small fighter, but he had the power to keep him off and keep him honest, but also he seemed to have an incredible endurance that he could go through those fights fighting bigger men and still be able to control the fights even later on. That is incredible, really. How many times have we seen in boxing where a larger physical fighter just sap the energy of the smaller fighter because the smaller fighter just doesn't have the physical strength to maintain that, that kind of fight on the inside with having the strength sap. But Langford could maintain that. It's an incredible thing he had. Coupled with the fact, like you said, about Gunboat Smith, Harry Wills said Langford was one of the most vicious body punchers he'd ever encountered. Wills said that Langford's body punches hurt like hell. And he were a fierce body puncher. And he also were very quick as well. He could knock 6'3", 6'5" men out with single shots. Incredible.
Yeah, and it's, studying his career, when just hearing the outline of his career, depending, as you get deeper into Langford's career, he really stands above, because there are certain other fighters who tried to fight this kind of schedule, but they didn't have the success he had with that schedule. I mean, at the heavyweight level, where lots of guys have stopping power, it's more common for heavyweights to have stopping power than the small divisions. And he is the smaller guy coming up. But as you guys both know, he fought. Even though he was avoided, it was a rich era, and he fought. Compared to most guys, he fought a who's who on his way up to heavyweight. But he did that before he was a heavyweight. Like today, he wouldn't have even broken 100% walking around after a training camp. He wasn't even 175. He was already well into heavyweight competition.
Well, if you think
Incredible.
about it nowadays, if he weighed 165, the sanctioning bodies wouldn't even allow him to fight an heavyweight.
That's right. I mean, he what was he, 154 against Johnson or something? I think he was
156
in.
and Johnson were 185.
Yeah, incredible. Bill Lang, he gave up. Let's see. I think he was in the upper 150s. Lang was almost 203 or something. He was just, and battling Jim. Battling Jim was an enormous guy who gave other top heavyweights tough fights. Like McVeigh like no one thought of Jim Johnson as an easy fight, even though they might get the best of him, but he was someone you had to really be careful for. And Langford was giving up just a ridiculous amount of size to a guy who was like a come forward battler. He earned the name. I'm not sure why certain fighters get battling attached to their name, but he definitely earned the title, that moniker. But Langford also given up weight to Sam McVeigh. Sam McVeigh, one of the most vicious knockout punchers of that era. And Langford's the smaller guy. Like, if you look through McVeigh's career and some of these other guys' career, other than fighting, say, like you take McVeigh, Jeanette, Langford specifically, and look at their records against each other is one thing, but look at their records against the field, separate from each other. Just like you could do with other great rivalries. Look at their records against everyone else, and then against each other separately. You can sometimes figure some things out, but Langford, even above these other all-time great heavyweights, I think he stands out. And especially when you're talking about a smaller guy, you're talking about someone who gave up size. So there are lots of great heavyweights, and and he was denied opportunity. The great Jack Johnson was himself denied opportunity for years. He then sort of mimicked that pattern, which is sad. And then when he lost his title, they locked it away in the great black heavyweights until Lewis couldn't get in. But Harry Wills, just to circle back to Harry Wills was Joe Louis who never got an opportunity. Harry Wills carried himself with dignity and did a lot to change the image of the black boxer in that time. So lots of credit to him. But Lewis was patterned. You have to don't gloat too much. Don't try to provoke people in this racist time, and maybe you can get opportunity. So the great Joe Louis did get opportunity, but he was, Jack Blackburn, as you know, his coach and mentor, who had competed in this early era. He knew what was up. So, it's tough. A lot of these guys were denied opportunity, and that's true of Langford. But in an irony, he was denied for his prime. He was denied by the first black, quote, I won't say world, but establishment champion, Jack Johnson. But Langford was something special.
Could I mention one other quick point as well? A little grievance I've always had when rating heavyweights, because it's amazing when you look at many people's top 20 heavyweights. They hardly ever include Sam Langford. Now, when you ask people who don't include him, why have you not included Sam Langford? They state, well, he's not really a heavyweight, he's a small fighter. But then on their heavyweight list, they will have Gene Tunney, who was not a career heavyweight. He was more a career light heavyweight. The heavyweight section were toward the end of his career. They will include other fighters who stepped up in weight to heavyweight who were not career heavyweights, even like Ezard Charles. He fought at middleweight, then a large portion of his career at light heavyweight before then fighting the significant third portion of his career at heavyweight. The credit Ezard Charles, the credit Gene Tunney, the credit this guy and that guy. But apparently Langford is singled out that he can't be included because he's a small fighter. And I say to any listeners, don't judge Langford at heavyweight based on him being a small fighter. Judge him on his career and his opposition and his accomplishments at heavyweight, because I don't care if a fighter goes to heavyweight from featherweight, middleweight, light heavyweight, cruiserweight. To me, I rate every heavyweight and what they have done at heavyweight. That is what gets them into my ratings. And sometimes I find it conflicting when people will put Gene Tunney in a top 10 heavyweights of all time, but then they say, well, Langford can't be in because he wasn't a proper heavyweight. I just wanted to point that out. I've always had a bit of a grievance with that.
Absolutely.
Can I add something as well, if you don't mind?
Please.
Great point, gentlemen. But Random, you asked BL and I a question when we first started this stream this evening. And the question was, how do we define greatness? And we gave you specific answers. And I want to add to that if I can. Greatness is a man who has the ability, or woman, but in a man who has the ability to overcome. And I think that was one of your criteria as well, Randall. And let's take a look at Sam Langford for one moment. When you look at Ray Robinson fought as a bantamweight in 1938, North American Metropolitan AAU Championship. He won. He tried to face Joey Maxim in 1952 in New York Yankee Stadium. He was winning, but he gassed out in 14 rounds. He didn't succeed. When you look at Sam Langford, he won the Boston Featherweight Championship title, 1902. And then he would go and meet all the champions, non-title fights, whatever the case is, from Joe Gans to Joe Walcott. He was in there with Jack Blackburn 6 times, Dave Holly. He would go up and he would challenge middleweights, the best that he can get opportunities with, Stanley Ketchel and many others. He would go up to light heavyweight. 1911, he defeated Philadelphia Jack O'Brien in 6 rounds, defeated him, stopped him. Non-title because he wasn't champion at that time. He goes all the way up to heavyweight, and he has basically more heavyweight fights than all the other divisions. One of the most knockouts in heavyweight history. 5'7" man. You're looking at a man who was basically blind in one eye for a tremendous amount of fights in his career. You're looking at a man who was dealing with segregation and discriminated against, and he was ducked and didn't get the fair opportunity, and so on and so on and so forth. So when you talk about fighter, these are all the criteria you need to have to be a fighter. So when you talk about a man who's a boxer, he has to have fighting in him as well. And no one had it better than Sam Langford. You can judge it based on his career. You can judge it based on his circumstances, the time in which he came, the men that he was in there with, the men that didn't want to fight him, and on and on and on. So you can't argue about Sam Langford being the greatest fighter because of all the intangibles that I explained to you. And even comparison with what Robinson has gone through. Sam Langford went through all of that. And he fought the greatest fighters of his time, those who he was allowed to face. He challenged men that would never challenge him, the Dempseys, the Tunneys, the Twin Sullivan and Mike Twin Sullivan, you know, those brothers, all of them. So you gotta look at that when you're judging a fighter, a man who has all the guts on the inside to deal with whatever he has to deal with to make sure that he completes what needs to be completed. And that's a man called Sam Langford.
Yeah, great stuff, Scrapbook. Love listening to that.
Absolutely, yeah, guys. We can talk about Langford all day long. This was the only certainty I had coming into this because I've studied his career to the degree with my peripheral awareness of other careers where there just is no career that checks as many boxes as Sam Langford's. And that's true just strictly at heavyweight for this era. You know, taken as a whole, his career is stunning and spans multiple weights. Like you said, BL, he was down, you know, he was down feather light and then made his way up. But it was what was it? Was it 1905 he fought Jeanette the first time?
Yes, and then he fought Johnson in 1906 for colored heavyweight title, but he turned pro in 1902. So basically, from being like 17 years old, well, he was 17, just under 18 years old when he beat Joe Gans. So he turned pro around 16, going on towards 17, and by the time he was 21, he'd fought in every division up to heavyweight.
Incredible.
Yeah, can I add that with BL? I'm sorry, man. I just want to add that with BL. In 1906, when he took on Jack Johnson, do you know 2 weeks before that fight, he was in a ring with Joe Jeanette? And the reason why he had a problem, he didn't do as well with Johnson in that first fight, is because he sprained his hand with Joe Jeanette. And 2 weeks later, he couldn't pass up the opportunity, so he walked into the ring with Jack Johnson, who never lost a title fight until 1915 in the 26th round with Jess Willard. I mean, this is incredible stuff when you really break it down of what this man actually accomplished, what he has gone through. It's really amazing as what he has done. I mean, his 1916, 1914. I mean, there's so many years that were great with Sam Langford. But when you just look at all those little details, who else is better than that? It's just amazing. It really, really is amazing.
Yeah, yeah, it's Scrapbook, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think because he, like, you guys correct me if I'm wrong, there's so many greats in this era, but Barbados Joe Walcott was one of the pound for pound greats of the previous era and extending into Langford's early career. And he shot himself in the hand, I think, was that 06 or 04? It was 04. He shot himself in the hand, so he was never quite the same. But Barbados Joe Walcott was an absolute legend, a multi-weight legend. And Langford, from what he said later in, I think, a 1924 retrospective, he said he grew up idolizing Bob Fitzsimmons, who himself was a small guy to be knocking out heavyweights. He was a famously hard puncher, blacksmith. And but Langford was trained by Georgie Byers and Bob Armstrong, and he got training also advice from Walsh from a bantamweight, eventual bantamweight, I think American champion. But you guys might be able to correct me on that. But he was trained by colored champions, and he was inspired by weight defying, because everyone loved Barbados Walcott. Like, he always praised him to the end of his days, the ability of Joe Walcott. And he said that no one hit him more, and he never hit anyone more than he hit Joe Walcott in their 1904 fight, which went to a draw, 15 rounds, I believe, to a draw in New Hampshire.
Right.
But Langford was trained by quality. He was world class. Like, he wasn't just some wailing away. People have a strange conception of boxing in this time because they don't understand the ratio of the importance of boxing to all of the rest of sports, as far as, you know, the betting public and sports going public. This was the thing right here. These guys were heroes.
Yes. And one other thing with that, Langford got a lot of tips from Danny Kramer and Jimmy Walsh. When he walked into the Lens Athletic Club, there was some man who actually took a look at him and saw something in him, as he was a janitor and he was watching men spar. He had that rage in him because of what happened in his home in Canada. So he was always the goods. He just needed some direction. He needed someone to really have a little confidence in him. And so he had some guys who really gave him some confidence and told him, you could do something with this. He had long arms, and I think he really had a good starting point. But man, he was something else. He really, really was. I mean, as a kid, his first couple of fights, he has the audacity to challenge the lightweight champion of the world and Joe Gans. And then the next year, Joe Walker.
He's not even 18. He's not even 18 when he does.
Amazing. Amazing stuff. Amazing stuff. Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
I mean, to back Scrapbook's point there, you know, Jimmy Walsh, who were a fantastic little bantamweight fighter, quick two-handed puncher and mover, very good fighter. When he were at the athletic club and Langford were janitoring, Langford were attracted to sparring. He used to watch sparring in between his cleaning and things like that. And then it turned out that he offered himself up for sparring when someone didn't show up. So he stepped in ring and he was taking some lickings. But I always remember a Jimmy Walsh quote where Jimmy Walsh said, well, I saw this kid get in there. He had no skills, but he can take some punishment. He was taking shots and he was still trying. He was still trying to land shots. And Jimmy Walsh said he recognized his heart, first of all. And then Jimmy Walsh said, I think I can do something with him. He could become something. And then he started showing him basic stances, foot stances, basic punches, you know, correct leverage. And then to have people like George Byers, who many people, Scrapbook will be aware of this, but many people may not be. George Byers, like Langford, was a fighter prior to Langford in 1890s, who I'm not 100% sure I'm right, but I think he was the first multi-weight coloured world champion. He titled coloured middleweight champion, then coloured heavyweight champion in 1890s. Langford, of course, would emulate that in the 1900s, being coloured middleweight champion, then being coloured heavyweight champion towards the end of that decade. But these great fighters coaching Langford, teaching him all the different techniques they knew and they had, you know, to me just planted that seed in him, coupled with his natural toughness, his strength and his attributes, that enabled him to go on and become a great fighter. And his heart, you know, because it's like I mentioned earlier, some people say, well, you know, he is a small guy. Yeah, he's a small guy fighting a 210-pound heavyweight wrecking machine, and he's taking clean punches. You know, we're talking about a fighter who used to let heavyweights hit him clean in sparring. And when they said, why are you letting people punch you in face with your hands down? He said, well, if I never get hit, I could avoid the punches easy. But if I never get hit in sparring, I'm going to go into the ring and get tagged clean, and I'm going to be shocked. My body's going to be shocked. I have to get used to it. So when I go in ring, I'm used to taking heavy punches. Just incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had trouble uploading some stuff I prepared for this. I had a couple more montages, but this one I have from a previous live chat. See how stocky he is. That video is from 1911, and he's in London to fight Bill Lang, who was 30 pounds heavier than him and been a contender for the world title, and fought for the Commonwealth title as well, I believe, and also possibly Australian title. But he destroyed him in London. But Langford was a special fighter, even amongst the special fighters, because he not only had the willpower, but he had the physique and the experience and ability. He was in the right place at the right time. Being in Boston, where he was when he began his career, where he was based from, he was in one of the richest parts of the world for boxing. So we mentioned Joe Walcott. Barbados Walcott lived in the Boston area, as did some other very talented fighters, and there were people training here, high-level people. So he had opportunity to become a great boxer, although he didn't get enough world title opportunities. He got the one against Barbados Walcott, but he didn't get another. But he was a very successful pugilist, and he did make a lot of money. He wasn't very careful with his money, and so like so many in boxing, he became a cautionary tale in that regard. But as far as the ability and willingness to overcome adversity, I put him at number one. He ducked nobody, and he did fantastic things. Do you gentlemen have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I just want to finish my conversation on Sam Langford by simply saying that Sam Langford, when he came from Canada and he wound up in Boston, George Byers similarly did the same thing. George Godfrey, a lot of them did that same thing. But it was Sam Langford who made the most out of the opportunity. And BL, you asked something that you were absolutely correct on. George Byers, he took on Frank Childs, and he was a two-time colored champion, heavyweight, middleweight. But Sam Langford did that 5 times. 5-time colored heavyweight champion. So no matter what man you talk about, when you look at Sam Langford, he has done it better than that other man did, if given the opportunity. And think about the age that he started doing what he did. I mean, it's just really remarkable. You just break these things down over and over again, and you can see more things that are impressive about Sam Langford. So Sam Langford, I think we're all in agreement, is the greatest fighter of all times. And this was a great conversation. I do appreciate the opportunity. And it was a pleasure speaking with you, gentlemen.
Yeah, this has been really enriching. I can't thank you guys enough. BL, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, just a brief one. I'd like to thank you, Random, for hosting this event. I'd especially also like to thank Scrapbook Boxing, my friend, for joining us again on this live stream. You know, it's always good, I think, to discuss fighters from different eras than the era we're in, because it shines light on many fighters who achieved incredible things and deserve to be remembered and respected for what they accomplished and for setting the path for many great fighters who followed them. You know, whether it's Sugar Ray Robinson, who idolized Joe Louis and other fighters. He also had a massive respect for Jack Blackburn and wanted Jack Blackburn to train him at one point, and even tried to go fishing with Jack Blackburn, so he had a reason to talk to him. You know, so many of these great fighters here, you know, whether it be Langford, number one, who in his time the amount of articles I've seen raving this is the greatest fighting machine they've ever seen. You know, whether it's the writer who said Harry Wills looks like he may be the greatest black fighter since Peter Jackson. You know, the accolades they won, you know, the incredible respect they won in the time, their incredible accomplishments and careers, and the challenges they faced, you know, is why talks like this are very important. Okay, so we can highlight many struggles and many careers that these fighters had. I think that's really important.
Yeah, it's definitely. I mean, there are just mythical levels of achievement that some of these guys made, and it's not just about titles, because really we're talking about martial arts. We're talking about competitive martial arts, and someone like Langford, it's hard to put anyone else up there. There are other fighters who, in their own realm, did remarkable things. But when we're talking about heavyweight boxing, the marquee division, and we're talking about arguably its richest or one of its 2 or 3 richest eras, certainly in the pace of competition, this blows away the other competitors for rich eras in heavyweight boxing. This was just a fantastic time, and boxing was big enough that you didn't just it wasn't just the champion who was a big celebrity. Like, the boxing was a big deal. Like Langford, you know, Langford and McVeigh, they drew over 15,000 people multiple times when they fought in Australia. That was big. Those were big events, you know, heavily covered. The training camps were covered. They were doing speaking engagements. I mean, these various fights that Langford was involved with, they weren't all small fights. They were important, regardless of how his finances were at the end of his career. And he just fought a who's who. And I would say in that quarter century, there is no heavyweight who spent as much time in the ring with great heavyweights, especially this remarkable 3-way series between Jeanette McVeigh and Langford. That's when I get deeper in Langford's career, I can't wait to get into the various battles they had. I've been researching. I'm just around to the time where he's about to fight Jeanette, I guess in 05. So I'm just crawling my way there. But yeah, this has been fantastic. I always learn a lot when I talk to you guys. Can't thank you enough. Thanks to everyone for tuning in, for spending your time on this. We love celebrating these old school fighters. Lots of exciting things happening in today's sports, but the level of greatness these guys radiated and what they actually did is definitely worth celebrating. It shouldn't be forgotten. Otherwise, people will start telling you that things that aren't really all that great are just totally great. You go, well, wait a minute. There are levels to this thing. Let's not lose our heads here. Boxing has a rich history of badasses doing incredible things. So even a couple high-level fights a year, that's fine. But there's a rich history of people doing more. Langford is an example of that. And a lot of the fighters he fought did great things. You know, he just had that. He had the opportunity for competition. He just didn't have the opportunity for all the acclaim that he probably deserved. And he was revered in the generations after. You know, later on, other storylines took over. But you know, in the time of Joe Louis, they knew who Langford was. He was the man. He was that mythical figure who was celebrated after his retirement. So this has been fantastic. I don't want to ramble on. If you guys have anything else to say, feel free. Or if you want to give a shout out to your channels or anything like that. I think I've just about expended my energy.
No, I've definitely expended my energy now. I'm all good. I am happy and at peace.
Yeah, and shout out to you, BL. You are indeed a machine, because when you said in your video yesterday that you had your excellent top 50 title fight records series, which everyone should go check out. When you said you had COVID, I was like, oh, we're gonna have to postpone this poor fella. And you are a machine. You, instead of postponing, you did a 2.5-hour talk on events of 100 or more years ago. Fantastic. Thank you so much. And Scrap, your time is, I just can't thank you enough for your involvement and your time. It means a great deal.
Thank you for having me, and BL, thank you so much for hanging in there with us, man. I know you must be feeling not yourself, obviously, and it shows that you represent what it is that you talk about. You hang in there, man, from bell to bell. So we appreciate that.
Yeah,
you can catch me on Scrapbook Boxing. Yeah.
Oh, real quick, guys, can I just give a couple of brief boxer shout outs who didn't, I don't think they made any of our lists, but there was maybe an argument for them? Just very quickly.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
BL, you mentioned the back, Marvin Hart probably deserves a lot of respect. Maybe didn't quite make the cut, but you know, I just wanted to give him a shout. I had some of the graphics I didn't get to upload, so I'm not even sure if I have many others. Who's this? Denver Martin. I made one for him. He was a factor at a time, although didn't have as large a career as the other gentleman in here. And I think and Burns did make a couple of our lists. So I think, and also a great, the great Bob Fitzsimmons, Ruby Rob, who by the turn of the century, he was he was coming past his competition excellence, but was still a huge factor in it, and a massive ambassador for boxing, and also a man who said that if you want to be the best, you got to fight everybody. I'm Jack Dempsey, but like Bob Fitzsimmons, so in an age when people are drawing color lines and being a bit basically acting in a way that today we would find embarrassing. Like, come on, man, quit making excuses, fight him. Bob Fitzsimmons, he was about it, and he also gave up a tremendous amount of size, so he didn't make the list, but certainly deserves mention, because coming into the turn of the century, Fitz was, as famous as anybody in the boxing realm. Is there anyone that you guys want to shout out, or should we close it out? What do you think?
We could close it out. I'll just say one last thing on Bob Fitzsimmons. It took 100 years for someone to match his record, Roy Jones Jr. That shows how special Bob Fitzsimmons was. Ruby Rob, Cornishman, very good fight. I always had tremendous respect. His first title was against non-pro Jack Dempsey as a middleweight. Then George Gardner as a light heavyweight. Well, actually, not even that. He went up to Boilermaker, Jim Jeffries. Then he went back down again to the light heavyweight. That's incredible stuff. So, yes, Bob Fitzsimmons. I always admire him. Great fighter he was.
Absolutely. Well, I actually have to go to work. This has been an incredible pleasure. Thanks to everyone in the chat. I'm sorry that we didn't get to any questions. I think someone asked where the battling moniker came from. I assumed that's a fight style, or is that related to someone being a soldier?
I'm not actually sure about that, to be honest. I think I'm not sure if it has a single defined beginning, or if it's just how we refer to certain fighters.
Well, thanks for the question, and I will try to find out and include it in a future live stream. I'll try and figure that out. I haven't really gotten into nicknames, although I won't say anything, but there's a couple things maybe in the works coming up that might relate to that somehow. I'll make sure to include it. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. I'm off to work. You gentlemen have done me a great service by joining me for this. This is a pleasure. And I look forward to checking out the content on your excellent channels.
No problem. Anytime.
Take care, guys.
All right. Take care now.